I gave up $1 billion fortune and tore up my own bloodline rather than sign my military merits over to my little brother. My father, a general with 3 stars and an ego the size of a continent, told me I was the stupidest son a man ever raised. He didn't know that the merits he was so casually trying to hand to my brother weren't medals or commendations. They were the rank of Grand Marshal of the entire Aurelian Empire, the highest military authority alive. A rank that outranked my own father by so much that, by imperial law, the moment war came, he would have to stand at attention and call me sir. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the dinner table because that's where they threw me away, and the look on their faces 6 weeks later is the only inheritance I ever wanted. My name is Ethan Vance, or it was until that night. The Kanes are a military dynasty, the kind of family that has portraits of dead generals in the hallway and treats a peacetime promotion like the birth of a god. My father is General Duncan Vance, commander of the 3rd Territorial Army, a man who has spent 40 years confusing the fear people feel for him with respect. My stepmother is Seraphina, who married into the name and spent 2 decades making sure her own son inherited the glory of it. And my younger brother is Landon Vance, the golden boy, the heir apparent, a man who has never been shot at, never slept in frozen mud, never watched a friend die, but who wears a uniform like a costume and has been told his whole life that greatness is his birthright. And then there was me, the first son, the inconvenient one. My mother was my father's first wife, and she died when I was 8, and within a year my father had married Seraphina, and within 2 years I had become a problem to be managed. I was a reminder of a dead woman in a house that wanted to forget her. So when I was 13, my father solved the problem the way military men solve problems. He shipped me off to the Frontier Academy at Coldfell, the worst posting in the Empire, a brutal institution on the northern border where they sent the sons nobody wanted and the orphans nobody claimed, where the washout rate was 60% and the survival rate not much better, because Coldfell sat in the shadow of the Volthon Confederacy and cadets there got real combat before they got razors. My father told the family I was being given a chance to prove myself. Everyone at that dinner table 15 years ago understood the truth. He was sending me somewhere he expected me to die, and clearing the path for Landon. I did not die. That, it turned out, was my entire revenge, and it took 15 years to deliver it. But on the night I want to tell you about, none of them knew any of that. As far as my family knew, Ethan Vance had spent 15 years as some forgettable mid-level officer at the ass end of the Empire, a major maybe. A man who'd scraped together a few obscure commendations on the frontier and come home, finally, at 30, to a family that had moved on without him. I'd been back 3 weeks. I'd said almost nothing. I'd let them believe exactly what they wanted to believe because I wanted to see, before I decided anything, whether 15 years had changed them. That dinner answered the question. Ethan. My father didn't look up from his wine. He never looked at me when he talked to me. It was a habit so old I'd stopped noticing it until I came back and noticed everything. Landon's promotion board meets next month. Brigadier General. Youngest in the family's history. A pause, heavy with the thing he wanted. The board looks at lineage merit. Combat citations in the bloodline can be formally transferred to a designated heir. It's an old provision, rarely used, but it's clean and it's legal. You have citations from the frontier. Coldfell service counts double for hardship. We've had the staff review it. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were flat and certain. The eyes of a man who has never once imagined being told no. You'll sign your service record over to Landon, all of it. Your citations become his lineage merit, and the board makes him a general at 28, and the Vance name gets its youngest flag officer in 300 years. It's the most useful thing you'll ever do for this family. Possibly the only useful thing. Seraphina smiled at me over the candles, the warm, poisonous smile she'd been giving me since I was 9. It's not as if you're using them, dear. A few frontier ribbons. On you, they're just decoration. On Landon, they're a legacy. And Landon, my little brother, the golden boy, didn't even have the grace to look uncomfortable. He swirled his wine and looked at me with lazy contempt and said, "Don't make it weird, Ethan. You spent 15 years freezing in a ditch for some medals nobody's ever heard of. Let them actually mean something. Let me put them somewhere they'll matter. It's the closest you'll ever get to a real career." He smiled. "Think of it as finally contributing. I want you to understand what they were actually asking, because they didn't understand it themselves, and that misunderstanding is the whole story. In the Aurelian military, your service record is sealed by rank classification. A major's record, a colonel's record, even a general's record. Those can be reviewed by family staff, transferred under the lineage provision, made legible to the world. But there is a tier above all of that. There is a classification reserved for exactly one position in the entire empire, a classification so high that the record doesn't appear in any database a family lawyer can reach, doesn't show a name, doesn't show citations, shows only a single line of black text that reads, "Authority sealed by order of the throne." Because the man who holds that record doesn't have citations, he has the whole army. His merit isn't a ribbon you can pin on your brother. It's the command of every soldier, every fleet, every fortress, every weapon in the empire. And it cannot be transferred, inherited, gifted, or stolen, because it isn't a decoration. It's a throne of its own. 3 years ago, in a war my family never even knew I fought in, on a frozen ridge above Coldfell where I held a collapsing line for 19 days against 4 times my number and turned a rout into the greatest victory in modern imperial history, the Empress herself had pinned a single star on my collar, a star no one else in the empire wears, and named me what the frontier soldiers had already been calling me for years, in voices full of something close to worship. Grand Marshal, Supreme Commander of all Aurelian forces, the Empire's sword, the youngest in 600 years. They called me Shadow, because I'd walked out of a battle no one was supposed to survive, and because the enemy never saw me coming until their lines were already broken. And I was sitting at my father's table, in a plain coat, being asked to sign my frontier ribbons over to a brother who'd never heard a shot fired in anger, so he could be made a 1-star general, a rank I could promote or destroy with a signature. I almost laughed. God help me, I almost laughed out loud at that table. 15 years of mud and blood and frozen ridges, and the family that threw me away to die wanted to harvest the one thing I'd built out of being thrown away and hand it to the boy they'd thrown me away for. There is a kind of cruelty so complete, so unconscious, that it stops being insulting and becomes almost beautiful in its symmetry. They wanted to take the only proof that I had survived their attempt to erase me and feed it to the erasure. So I set down my fork, and for the first time in 3 weeks, I looked my father directly in the eyes, and I held them, and I watched the small flicker of surprise that crossed his face, because the forgettable frontier major wasn't supposed to hold a 3-star general's gaze without flinching. "No," I said. The table went silent. I don't think anyone had said no to my father in 20 years. "Excuse me?" His voice dropped to the register he used on subordinates, the one that had broken 1,000 junior officers. "You heard me," I said calmly. "I won't sign my record over to Landon. Not the citations, not the service history, not a single line of it. It's mine. I bled for every word in it, on a border you've never visited, in a war you don't even know happened. And you don't get to feed it to him because you decided 15 years ago that he was worth more than me." I kept my voice level, almost gentle, which I could see unsettled my father more than shouting would have. "You sent me to Coldfell to die, father. Let's at least be honest about that here, at the table for once. You looked at a 13-year-old boy whose only crime was reminding you of a wife you'd already replaced, and you sent him to the deadliest posting in the empire and called it a chance. I survived it, and now you want what I built out of surviving it. The answer is no. It will always be no." Seraphina's face had gone white with anger. Landon set down his wine, the lazy contempt curdling into something uglier. And my father stood up slowly from the head of the table, drawing himself up to his full height, the height that had intimidated cabinet ministers and foreign attachés, and he delivered the line he thought was a death sentence. "Then you are no son of mine," General Duncan Vance said, his voice shaking with fury. "If you will not serve this family with the one worthless asset you possess, then you are not part of it. I'll have the lawyers draw the papers tonight. You'll be struck from the will, struck from the family register, struck from the name. You'll walk out of this house with nothing, Ethan. No fortune, no inheritance, no name. Do you understand what you're throwing away? Billions. The Vance legacy. Everything. over pride, over a handful of frontier ribbons. He leaned forward, knuckles on the table. Sign the record over, or you leave this family forever with nothing to your name but the dirt you came back in. And here is the moment I'd waited 15 years for without even knowing it. Because my father thought he was offering me a terrible choice, and he didn't understand that he was offering me the only thing I'd ever wanted, which was the chance to be free of all of them while keeping the one thing that was truly mine. I stood up. I buttoned my plain, cheap coat, and I smiled at my father, a calm, quiet, almost grateful smile. The smile of a man being handed his own liberation by the very people who'd tried to chain him. You think you're taking everything from me, I said, but you've got it backwards, the way you've had it backwards my whole life. You can keep the fortune. You can keep the house and the name and the portraits in the hallway. You can give land in all of it, every coin, every acre, every dead general on the wall. I walked to the end of the table, and I paused beside my father, close enough to see the confusion start to crack through his fury, because the disowned, ruined, penniless son was not behaving like a ruined man. Because the one thing you wanted, the one thing you tried to take, my record, my service, the work of my hands, that's the one thing in this universe you can never have. It doesn't transfer, it can't be inherited, and it cannot be signed away, no matter how many lawyers you hire, for reasons that you, General, are not cleared to know. I let that land. Sign your papers. Strike me from the name. I renounce the Vance fortune, the Vance title, and the Vance blood, freely, gladly, and forever. Effective tonight. I walked to the door, and at the door I stopped and I gave them one last gift, a single sentence, the only warning they would get, the only mercy in me that 15 years of frost hadn't killed. One day soon, I said without turning around, this empire is going to need its sword. And when that day comes, every general in Aurelia, including you, Father, is going to kneel to one man. I'd think very carefully in the meantime about the son you just threw out into the dark with nothing. I opened the door to the cold night. Because the last time you sent me out into the dark with nothing, I came back something you can't even imagine. And this time, I'm not coming back at all. You'll have to come find me, on your knees. The whole rotten lot of you. And I walked out of the Vance estate into the night, a man with no fortune, no name, and no family, carrying the only thing I'd ever owned and the only thing that mattered, sealed in black ink under the authority of the throne. Behind me I heard Landon laugh, a high, ugly laugh, and call out into the dark, "Good luck with nothing, brother. Enjoy the ditch." I smiled all the way to the car that was waiting for me at the bottom of the drive. The car they didn't notice. The matte black armored staff car with no plates, flying no flags, that had been sitting at the foot of the Vance estate for the entire dinner, because the Grand Marshal of the Aurelian Empire does not go anywhere, not even to be disowned by his father, without his security detail. The driver, a hard-faced master sergeant named Marquez, who had followed me out of Coldfell and would follow me into hell, opened the rear door and snapped to attention as I approached. "How did it go, sir?" he asked quietly. "They threw me out of the family," I said, sliding into the back seat. "Disowned, penniless," struck from the name. Marquez's jaw tightened, the way it did when he wanted to put someone through a wall on my behalf, which was often. "And you let them?" I looked back at the warm, golden windows of the house that had thrown me away twice now, 15 years apart, and I felt the last thread connecting me to it finally, cleanly, snap. I felt lighter than I had in my entire life. "I let them," I said. "Take me to Central Command, Sergeant. The Volthon buildup on the northern border isn't slowing down. The Empress wants the war plan by morning." I closed my eyes as the car pulled away into the dark. "And tell the staff to flag any promotion board paperwork that comes through with the name Landon Vance on it. I want to be personally informed the moment my little brother tries to become a general." I smiled, and it was not a kind smile, not anymore. I'd hate to miss it. The car carried me away from the Vance name and toward the war that was coming. The war that would, within 6 weeks, bring my father, my stepmother, and my golden boy brother face to face with the disowned son they'd thrown into the dark. And on that day, they would learn what the ditch had made of me. On that day, the whole empire would. But that night, I just leaned back in the dark of the staff car, free for the first time in 30 years, and let myself feel something I hadn't felt at that table, hadn't let myself feel in front of them. The thing that had been waiting under 15 years of frost for exactly this moment. I started to laugh, and the Grand Marshal of the Aurelian Empire laughed all the way to Central Command, because his family had just handed him his freedom and called it a punishment, and they had absolutely no idea what they had just done. Central Command rises out of the heart of the imperial capital like a mountain made of black stone and steel, a fortress within the city. And when my staff car passed through the final checkpoint that night, every soldier on the gate snapped to a salute so sharp you could have cut bread with it. Not because they were told to, because of who was in the car. There is a particular quality to the salute a soldier gives the man who held the line at Coldfell, a man most of them have only heard about in stories, and I have never gotten used to it, and I hope I never do, because the day a commander gets used to that salute is the day he stops deserving it. Let me tell you what the Empire actually looks like, since my family's dinner table is a very small and very stupid corner of it. The Aurelian Empire is the great power of the northern world, and for 300 years it has been locked in a cold and frequently hot rivalry with the Volthan Confederacy, a militarized federation of warlord states to the north whose entire culture is built around the idea that Aurelia is soft, decadent, and overdue for conquest. The border between us runs for 2,000 miles through the worst terrain on the continent, frozen mountains and black forests, and the long, bleak tundra where I grew up. Coldfell Academy sits at the most exposed point of that border, which is why the Empire sends its unwanted sons there, and why those unwanted sons, the ones who live, come out harder and deadlier than anything the soft southern academies produce. The Volthans have a saying about Coldfell graduates. You do not see them until you are already dead. They got that saying from me. The Empire is ruled from the Iron Throne by the Sterling dynasty, and at the time of that dinner, the throne was held by a young woman who had inherited it 3 years earlier when her father died, and who had spent those 3 years proving to every doubting old man in the Empire that she was twice the sovereign her father had been. Her name was Anya Sterling, the Empress. They called her the Iron Princess before her coronation and the Iron Throne's truest heir after it. And they called her, behind her back and in tones of fear, the Winter Queen, because she was beautiful the way a frozen lake is beautiful, and just as safe to underestimate. She was 26 years old. She had a mind like a war and a spine like a blade, and she was the only person in the entire empire I called by her first name, and the only person in the entire empire who called me by mine. I should explain that because it matters, and because my family is about to humiliate themselves over it in ways you will deeply enjoy. 3 years ago, on the frozen ridge above Coldfell, when the line broke and the Volthans poured through and the southern generals had already written off the entire northern front and were drawing up the surrender terms in the capital, it was the Empress, then newly crowned, 23 years old, who refused to abandon the north. Every advisor told her it was lost. Every general told her to cut her losses. And a young sovereign who had been on the throne for 90 days looked at a battlefield report with a single unfamiliar name on it. An obscure frontier officer who was somehow still holding a piece of a line that should have collapsed 9 days earlier, and she did something no one expected. She got on a military transport, against the screaming objections of her entire court, and she flew to the front, to Coldfell, to see for herself the man who wouldn't break when everyone else had. She found me on the 19th day on that ridge, filthy and bleeding and running on nothing, commanding a force a quarter the size of the enemy's with tactics the war colleges hadn't invented yet, having turned a rout into a slaughter, having broken the Volthan offensive so completely that they would not try again for 3 years. She found me, and she did not see a frontier major. She saw the sword the Empire had been missing for 600 years. And on that ridge, in front of what was left of my command, she pinned a single star to my collar and named me Grand Marshal of all Aurelian forces, the youngest in the history of the Empire, over the heads of 50 senior generals who had already given up the North, and she said, in front of everyone, in a voice that the whole Empire would repeat for years, "The Empire breaks where its cowards command and holds where its true men stand. From this day, Aurelia's sword has a name, and the name is Marshal Vance, and any man who questions it questions me. And then, more quietly, just to me, she had said something else, something the cameras didn't catch, something that began the strangest and most important relationship of my life. She'd looked at the exhausted ruin of me and she'd said, "I have been surrounded by men who tell me what I want to hear since the day I was born. You held a line everyone told me to abandon, and you were right, and they were wrong. I am going to need that for the rest of my reign. I am going to need exactly one person in this empire who will tell me the truth, even when it costs him. Will you be that person, Marshal? Not the sword. Any soldier can be a sword. The other thing. The harder thing." And I, half dead on a frozen ridge, had looked at this young sovereign who'd flown into a war zone to find the truth herself, and I'd said, "Yes, Your Majesty, always the truth, even when you hate me for it." And she'd smiled, the first real smile I ever saw from the Winter Queen, and she'd said, "Especially then." So that's who I was, the night my father disowned me for refusing to hand my frontier ribbons to my brother. I was the Empress's sword and the Empress's truth, the second most powerful person in the Aurelian Empire, a man whose signature could make or unmake any general alive. And I had spent 3 weeks letting my family believe I was a forgettable nobody, because I wanted to know, before the war came, whether the people who threw me away had any good in them at all. They didn't. And that, strangely, was a relief. It meant that what was coming for them was not cruelty. It was justice. And justice is so much easier to live with. The war room that night was already lit and humming when I arrived, my staff rising as I entered, and I waved them back to work and went straight to the great table where the northern front glowed in light, 2,000 miles of border rendered in cold blue and angry red. Colonel Felix Gray, my deputy and the closest thing I had to a brother who actually deserved the word, met me at the table with a grim expression and a data slate. "The build-up's accelerating, sir," he said without preamble. Felix never wasted a word, which is why I loved him. "Volthon forces massing at 3 points along the northern range. Their warlord General Schneider took personal command at the border 4 days ago. That's not a drill posture. That's a man who intends to cross." He pulled up the projections. Intelligence puts the timeline at 6 to 8 weeks. They've learned from Coldfell. They're not coming at one point this time. They're coming at all of them, simultaneously, to stretch us thin and break through where we're weakest. He looked at me. "And they think they know where we're weakest because 3 years ago you weren't the Marshal yet, and the Southern commands are still soft, still political, still run by men who got their stars from their fathers instead of from a battlefield. Men who got their stars from their fathers instead of from a battlefield. I thought, of course, of Landon, of the promotion board next month, of a soft golden boy about to be handed a general's stars on the strength of frontier ribbons he'd never earned, to be placed in command of real soldiers, on a real border, 6 weeks before the Volthan Confederacy came across it. And the cold thing in me, the Coldfell thing, the thing that does not get angry but gets precise, looked at the timeline and understood something my family was too small to see. The war and my brother's promotion were going to arrive at the same time, and one of them was going to destroy the other. "Felix," I said, "pull the file on the Southern Command promotion boards for next quarter. Every officer up for a star. I want to know which incompetents are about to be handed real commands right before a real war." I traced the red massing on the northern range with one finger. And flag one in particular, a board candidate named Landon Vance, up for Brigadier General, no combat record, family lineage merit application pending. My finger stopped. He's my brother, and his father just disowned me tonight for refusing to hand him my service record so he could steal a general's stars he hasn't earned. So I have a personal interest in exactly how badly that's going to go for everyone involved. Felix, who knew the whole story, who had been at Coldfell with me, who had watched my family's neglect from a distance for 15 years and hated them with the clean, loyal hatred of a man who'd chosen me as his real family, allowed himself the smallest, hardest smile. "Lineage merit transfer," he said, "from your record." The smile widened a fraction. "Sir, your record is sealed under throne authority. It doesn't exist in any database the Vance family lawyers can reach. The moment they file that transfer application, it's going to hit a classification wall they don't even have the clearance to see the height of." He set down the slate. When a lineage merit application references a sealed throne record, do you know what the system does? Tell me, I said, though I already knew because I'd written half the regulations myself. It doesn't reject the application, Felix said. Rejection would reveal that the record exists at a throne tier, which is itself classified. So instead, it flags the application for review by the office of the Grand Marshal, personally, because the only authority cleared to rule on a throne-sealed record is the man who holds the throne's military seal. His eyes glittered. Which is you. Your brother's application to steal your stars is going to land on your desk, sir, with your own name on the sealed record it's trying to plunder, and a little box at the bottom that says, Approve or Deny, signed by the Grand Marshal. He actually laughed, a short bark of a thing. Your father disowned you to take your record, and the only man in the Empire with the authority to give him your record is you. I looked at the war glowing on the table, the storm gathering on the border where I'd been revised and abandoned and forged, and I thought about my brother's high, ugly laugh in the dark. Enjoy the ditch. And I thought about my father's certainty that he'd stripped me of everything. And I thought about the little box at the bottom of an application that was, even now, probably being drafted by a Vance family lawyer. Approve or deny. Let it come, I said. Don't expedite it, don't delay it. Let it move through the system at exactly the speed it would move for anyone. I want it to land on my desk naturally. I want Landon to spend a month telling everyone he's about to be a general. I want my father to brag about it at his club. I want Serafina to start planning the celebration. I straightened up from the table. And then, when the war is about to break, when the Empire needs its real soldiers and my family is mid-celebration, the application is going to reach my desk, and I'm going to mark that little box, and the entire Vance family is going to discover, all at once, in the worst possible way, exactly who they threw out into the dark. I turned to go draft the war plan the Empress needed by morning. Justice, Felix, is a dish best served through proper administrative channels. Now, the Volthans. Walk me through Schneider's 3 points. We have an empire to save and a family to bury, and I'd like to do both before breakfast. That night, I worked until dawn on the plan that would, 6 weeks later, shatter the largest Volthan offensive in 3 centuries. And somewhere across the city, in a warm, bright house I would never enter again, my family slept soundly, dreaming of fortunes and promotions and the satisfying memory of having finally rid themselves of the inconvenient first son. They had no idea that the inconvenient first son had spent the night designing the salvation of the Empire. They had no idea that the obscure frontier ribbons they'd tried to steal were the visible edge of the most powerful military command in the northern world. They had no idea that the ditch had made a god, and that they had just thrown the god out of the house and told him to enjoy the cold. They would find out. The whole empire would find out. And the finding out would begin, as these things so often do, with a single piece of paper, moving slowly and inevitably through the proper administrative channels toward a little box at the bottom marked Approve or Deny. I could not wait. There was a woman, because of course there was. In stories like mine, there is always a woman who looked at a man when he had nothing and decided he was worth nothing, and who will, in the fullness of time, get to watch exactly how wrong she was. Her name was Alara Blackwood, and 3 years ago she had been my fiancée, and she had jilted me for my brother in a scene so perfectly humiliating that I sometimes think the universe arranged it specifically so that the eventual reversal would taste this good. The Crowleys are old money. The kind of family that married into military dynasties for the prestige and out of them for the cash. And a match between Alara and Vance had been arranged when we were both young, back when I was still, technically, the heir. By the time I came home on my first frontier leave at 20, I was no longer the heir in anything but name, and Alara Blackwood had eyes that calculated faster than a targeting computer. I remember the exact dinner, 3 years before the one where my father disowned me, when she set down her glass and looked at me across the table, this frontier officer in a plain coat who smelled of cold and wood smoke, and she said in front of both families, "I've thought about it carefully, and I don't think I can marry a man with no future. Ethan, you're a soldier on a dead-end posting at the end of the world. You'll be a major when you're 50. Landon is going to be a general, a flag officer, a name. I'd be a fool to tie myself to the brother who got sent away to be forgotten." and she had stood up, walked around the table, and sat down next to Landon, and taken his hand, and my father had said, "Sensible girl." And my stepmother had smiled, and my brother had smirked at me over the candles, and I had finished my dinner in silence and gone back to the frontier 2 days early. What none of them knew, what I had told no one, was that I had flown home on that leave wearing a plain coat over a uniform I was not permitted to show anyone, because 4 months earlier, on a black ridge in the north, I had already done the thing that would make me marshal, and the Empress had already pinned the star to my collar, and the only reason the whole empire didn't yet know my name was that the elevation of a new Grand Marshal in wartime is itself a state secret until the sovereign chooses to reveal it. So Ilara Blackwood had sat at that table and chosen my brother over a man she called a dead-end major, while that man was, in sealed and classified fact, already the second most powerful person in the Aurelian Empire. She had traded the sword of the Empire for a soft boy with a famous name because she could only see the plain coat and not the star beneath it. I had let her. I had let all of them choose the lie they wanted, because I have learned that the cruelest and most complete revenge you can take on people who judge by appearances is to simply let them keep judging and wait. Now, 3 years later, the wait was almost over, and the universe, which has a sense of humor, arranged for me to be standing in the lobby of the Imperial Officers Club in my plain coat on legitimate business, on the very afternoon that the Vance and Blackwood families swept in to celebrate 2 things at once: Landon and Ilara's formal engagement, and the imminent, certain, already being toasted promotion of Landon Vance to Brigadier General. I saw them before they saw me. Serafina in furs, Ilara on Landon's arm glittering with a ring that cost more than a frontier soldier earns in a decade, my father holding court among a knot of Southern officers, all of them laughing too loud the way people do when they're performing success. And I stood quietly by a pillar in my plain coat, the disowned son, the penniless ditch dweller, the man with nothing, and I watched my family celebrate the theft they thought they'd gotten away with, and I felt nothing but a vast and patient calm, because I had read the morning's intelligence, and I knew that the Vulcan Confederacy would cross the northern border in approximately 5 weeks, and that everything these people were celebrating was about to walk straight into the worst war in 300 years. It was Ilara who spotted me. Her eyes did the old calculation, sweeping over the plain coat, the lack of insignia, the obvious poverty of a man cut off from his family, and she smiled. And she steered Landon over with the cruelty of a woman who wants an audience for her good fortune. "Ethan," she said, loud enough for the nearby officers to turn, "I almost didn't recognize you. You look, well," her smile sharpened. "You look like exactly what you are, I suppose. I heard your father finally cleaned house. Disowned, penniless, struck from the name, all over a few worthless medals you wouldn't share with your own brother." She tilted her head, and the ring caught the light. "I have to say, it confirms I made the right choice 3 years ago. Imagine if I'd married you. I'd be the wife of a nameless beggar instead of the future wife of a general. You always did let pride ruin you, Ethan. It's almost sad." Landon laughed, delighted, the golden boy basking. "Be nice, Ella. He's family. Or, well," he smirked. "He was. What are you even doing here, Ethan? This is the officers' club. They let ditch majors in the lobby now?" Several of the Southern officers chuckled. "Did you come to congratulate me? Brigadier General, 28 years old. The board confirms it next week. The lineage merit went through clean. Funny thing that, all those frontier ribbons you wouldn't give me, turns out the staff found a way around you. Once you were struck from the family, your service record reverted to the family estate, and the estate signed it over to me. So I got your medals after all, brother. I got them, and your inheritance, and your fiancée, and you got the ditch." He spread his hands, grinning. "Remind me again which of us let pride ruin him. I want to record, for the sake of honesty, that there was a part of me, a small human part, that even 15 years of frost hadn't fully killed, that wanted to tell them right there. Wanted to watch the smiles fall off their faces in real time. It would have been so easy. 3 words. I'm the Marshal. And the whole lobby would have hit the floor. But I have spent my life learning the difference between a satisfying strike and a decisive one. And a good commander never spends a decisive advantage on a satisfying one. So I let the cold fell calm settle over me, and I gave my brother a small, quiet smile. And I said only this: Congratulations, Landon. Truly. A general's stars are a serious thing. They mean that very soon, real soldiers on a real border will follow you into real danger, and their lives will depend on your judgment. I looked at him, this soft, laughing boy who had never been shot at, about to be handed command of men on the eve of a war he didn't know was coming. I hope, for their sake, you're ready for what that actually means. I hope you understand that a star isn't a prize you win from your family. It's a debt you owe to the men who'll die if you're wrong. I buttoned my plain coat. But you don't understand that. You can't, because you've never stood on a line that was breaking, and the Empire is about to find out, the hard way, what happens when it hands the breaking lines to men who got their stars from their fathers. I turned to go. Enjoy your party, genuinely. Enjoy every minute of it. I have a feeling it's the high point. And I walked out of the officers' club, leaving them puzzled and faintly unsettled, the way you're unsettled by a man who should be groveling and instead pities you, and Alara called after me, shrill and uncertain. He's lost his mind! Poverty's broken him! And Landon laughed again, but it was a thinner laugh than before, because some animal part of him had heard the absolute certainty in my voice and didn't understand it. And a soft man is never more afraid than when a hard man pities him and won't say why. But the engagement was not the most dangerous thing my family did that month. The most dangerous thing, the thing that would turn their eventual humiliation from a private disaster into a public catastrophe. The family ambition that overreached so badly that it became almost a kind of suicide, was this. Serafina decided that a general's stars weren't enough. She decided the Vance family should reach for the throne itself. I learned about it from Felix, who learned about it from the court, because nothing happens in the imperial court that doesn't reach the Grand Marshal's office within a day. The Empress was unmarried. The Empress was 26, and there was a faction of old nobles at court, the kind of men who cannot imagine a woman ruling without a husband to guide her, who had been pressuring Anya for 2 years to choose a consort and secure the dynasty. The Empress had refused every candidate with a cold precision that had become legendary, sending dukes and princes and foreign royals home with their pride in pieces. But the pressure was real, and the political faction pushing it was powerful, and into this opening, with the breathtaking ambition of the truly stupid, stepped Serafina Vance. She petitioned the court to put Landon forward as a candidate for the Empress's hand. The logic in her mind was flawless. Landon was about to be the youngest general in the Empire. The Kanes were an ancient military dynasty. A marriage between the Iron Throne and the Empire's most storied military family would, she argued, bind the crown to the sword and secure the realm. She had the petition drafted by the finest lawyers, endorsed by the consort faction nobles who saw the Kanes as a useful tool, and submitted formally to the imperial court for the Empress's consideration. And across the capital, in drawing rooms and clubs, the whisper began. The Kanes are reaching for the throne. The golden boy might marry the Winter Queen. When Felix told me, he was trying very hard not to laugh, and failing. "Sir," he said, "your stepmother has formally petitioned to marry your brother to the Empress." He had to stop and breathe. "To the Empress has petitioned to marry your soft little brother. To the woman who flew into a war zone to find you, who named you her sword, who calls you Ethan, who has told the entire court for 2 years that she will marry no one." He lost the battle entirely and laughed, a great unprofessional bark. "Your family is trying to marry the throne to the very man whose stolen merits belong to the marshal that throne would have to consult about the match. Do you understand what's about to happen? The consort petition, by imperial protocol, requires a security and suitability review of the candidate, and the security review of any candidate for the imperial consort is conducted by and signed off by." He could barely get it out. "By the office of the Grand Marshal, by you. Your stepmother's petition to make your brother the Empress's husband is going to land on your desk for review, right next to your brother's application to steal your stars. Both of them. On your desk, with your signature required. Approve or deny." I sat in my office at Central Command, the war on the northern border glowing red on every screen, the largest Vulcan offensive in 3 centuries 5 weeks out, and I considered the magnificent, suicidal arrogance of the family that had thrown me into the dark. They had not been content to steal my inheritance, my fiancée, and my stars. They had reached higher. They had reached for the one woman in the empire who was mine in every way that mattered, except the one the court kept pushing her toward. The woman who knew exactly who I was, who I worked beside every day, who I was beginning to understand I would die for and, more dangerously, live for. They had petitioned to give her to Landon, and the security review was going to land on my desk. I thought of Anya, the Iron Throne's true heir, the Winter Queen who had told me on a frozen ridge that she needed exactly one person who would tell her the truth. And I thought about how she was going to react when she learned that the Vance family had formally petitioned to marry her to a soft golden boy who had stolen his stars from her own Marshal. And a slow, cold smile spread across my face, because I had seen the Empress destroy ambitious nobles for far less, and I almost felt sorry for my family. Almost. "Felix," I said, "has the Empress seen the petition yet?" "It's in her morning brief tomorrow." "Good." I stood and walked to the window overlooking the capital, the great city I'd been raised to be forgotten by, and had instead been raised, by exile and frost and blood, to protect. Let her see it. Don't flag it. Don't warn her. Let her find it in her brief like any other petition. I watched the lights of the city, my city now, in every way that counted. I want to be in the room when she reads my brother's name on a petition to marry her. Schedule me for the morning war briefing. I'll arrive early. The cold smile again. I have a feeling the Empress is going to want to discuss the Vance family's ambitions, and I want to be there when she does. I want to watch the Winter Queen learn that the man who stole the Marshal's stars now wants to steal his sovereign too. Because here is the thing my family never understood, the thing that was about to undo them completely. They thought power was a fortune you inherited, and a name you carried, and a marriage you arranged. They thought you reached up and took the throne the way you reach up and take a citation off a shelf. They had no idea that real power in the Aurelian Empire ran through exactly two people, a Marshal forged in a ditch they'd thrown him into, and an Empress who'd flown into a war to find him, and that those two people had spent 3 years building something between them that no petition, no lawyer, no ambitious stepmother in furs could ever touch. The Kanes had reached for the throne, and they had no idea that the throne and the sword were about to reach back. The Empress was already reading when I arrived at the war room the next morning, 20 minutes early, and I knew from the absolute stillness of her that she'd reached the petition. Anya Sterling did not fidget, did not pace, did not show anger the way ordinary people showed it. When the Winter Queen was truly angry, she went still, completely still. The stillness of deep ice over very cold water, and the whole room went quiet around her the way a forest goes quiet before a storm. Her staff had found reasons to be elsewhere. Only Felix remained, by the door, and when he saw me, he gave the smallest nod and slipped out, leaving me alone with my sovereign and the petition to marry her to my brother. "Marshal," she said without looking up. She always called me Marshal in front of others and Ethan when we were alone. And the fact that there was no one else in the room and she'd said Marshal told me she was holding herself very carefully. "Did you know about this?" "I knew it was coming," I said. "I didn't warn you. I wanted you to see it cold, the way you'd see any petition, without my reaction coloring yours. You've always told me you can't trust a thing once someone's told you how to feel about it first." That finally brought her eyes up. They were gray, the gray of a winter sea, and they found mine and held them, and something in them eased, fractionally, because I'd done the thing she trusted me to do, which was tell her the exact truth about my own calculation, even when it didn't flatter me. "The Vance family," she said, setting the petition down with a precision that was more frightening than if she'd thrown it. "Your family. The family that disowned you 6 weeks ago for refusing to hand your service record, my Marshal's sealed record, to your brother. That family has now formally petitioned to marry that same brother to me." She laced her fingers together. "They want to give the man who stole your stars my throne to stand beside. They've reached past the sword and grabbed for the crown. And they did it in writing, with lawyers, and submitted it to my court, where every ambitious noble in the consort faction is already using it to renew the pressure for me to marry." Her voice was very quiet and very level. "Tell me about your brother, Ethan. Tell me the truth, not the careful version. Is he a fool? or is he dangerous? I considered the question seriously because Anya asked questions she actually wanted answered, and giving her a comfortable answer was the one thing that could lose me her trust forever. Landon is a fool, I said, but the petition isn't his, it's Seraphina's. My stepmother is not a fool. She's something more dangerous, an intelligent person with no judgment, which is to say a person whose cleverness all points in one direction, getting more for her son, and never asks whether the direction is wise. She'll have made promises to the consort faction to get their endorsement. She'll have offered them the Vance military influence, which means she's offered them my father's army, which means my father has agreed to put the 3rd Territorial Army's political weight behind a faction that's trying to force your hand on marriage. I watched that land because it mattered far more than the petition itself. That's the real danger, Anya, not Landon, the 3rd Army. My father has spent 40 years building political capital, and Seraphina has just spent it buying my brother a shot at your throne, which means the Vance family is now formally aligned with the court faction that wants to control you through a marriage. 6 weeks before the largest Vulthan offensive in 300 years, one of your 4 major army commands has just declared itself a political instrument of the faction trying to leash its own sovereign. I let the silence sit. Your family asked you a question this morning, Empress, and it wasn't who you'll marry. It was who commands the 3rd Army when the war comes. A man loyal to you, or a man who's just sold his loyalty to a faction for his wife's ambition. The room was very quiet. Outside, the capital went about its morning, ignorant of the war 5 weeks away, and the smaller, quieter war being fought in the war room over a single petition. And Anya Sterling looked at me for a long moment, and then she did something she rarely did. She let the Empress fall away just for a moment and let me see the woman underneath, 26 years old and carrying the weight of an empire and surrounded by men who all wanted something from her. And she said quietly, "Do you know what I hate most about this petition, Ethan? It's not the ambition. Ambition I understand. Ambition I can work with. It's that they tried to give you to me wrapped in the wrong skin. They looked at the Vance family and they saw a soft golden boy and they thought, that's the one worth offering the Empress. And the actual worth of that family, the actual sword, the one man in it who's worth more than the whole estate and the name and the 300 years of dead generals on the wall, they threw into the dark 15 years ago and disowned 6 weeks ago. And it never once occurred to them to offer me that one." Her gray eyes held mine, and there was something in them I'd been carefully not naming for 3 years, because naming it was dangerous for both of us, the Empress and her Marshal, the throne and the sword. They offered me Landon, when they had you the whole time. The fools. The air in the room had changed. We were standing very close to a line we'd never crossed, the line we both knew was there. The line that protocol and duty and the brutal politics of a court that would use any weakness against her had kept us behind for 3 years. And I am a man who has held breaking lines on frozen ridges against impossible odds. And I will tell you honestly that holding that line in that quiet room, with the Winter Queen looking at me like that, was harder than cold fell. "Empress," I said carefully, because one of us had to be careful and it had never once been her. "The consort faction is watching everything you do. If you favor your marshal too openly right now, in the middle of their pressure campaign, they'll use it. They'll say you're controlled by the military. They'll say the sword has captured the crown. They'll turn the thing between us into a weapon against your reign before the war even starts." I made myself step back from the line, for her sake, the way I'd been doing for 3 years. "So here is what I think we should do, and I think you already know it. Let the petition proceed. Let it come to my office for the security review, exactly as protocol demands. And let me, the Grand Marshal, conduct an entirely fair, entirely thorough, entirely by-the-book suitability review of Brigadier General candidate Landon Vance as a potential imperial consort." The cold smile found me. "And let the review find what an honest review must find. Because the moment the petition referenced a candidate whose military credentials rest on a lineage merit transfer, it made his military record part of the suitability question. And his military record, Empress, is built entirely on stolen stars and a sealed file he was never cleared to touch. An honest review won't have to invent a single thing. It will simply have to tell the truth about what Landon Vance actually is. And the truth will destroy the petition, destroy the lineage transfer, destroy the consort faction's chosen instrument, and expose the Vance family's entire ambition as a fraud built on theft, all through proper channels, all with my signature, all completely legal, and all, crucially, without you having to lift a finger or reveal anything about us. I inclined my head. Your enemies handed you a sword and asked you to fall on it. Let me hand it back to them point first. Anya looked at me, and slowly, the Empress came back into her face, the Winter Queen, and with her came a smile I had only seen a handful of times in 3 years, the smile that meant she had decided to destroy someone and was going to enjoy it. Conduct the review, Marshal, she said, thoroughly, by the book, leave nothing out. She picked the petition back up, and this time there was something almost playful in the precision of it. And Ethan, she paused. When the review is complete, and the Vance family's fraud is exposed, and the consort faction's instrument is in pieces, the question of who I marry will still be open. The pressure won't go away because one bad petition failed. Her gray eyes held mine over the document. We'll have to discuss it, properly, after the war, when there's no faction left strong enough to use the truth against me. And she said it like a fact, like a coordinate on a map, like a thing that was simply going to happen once the obstacles were cleared, and then she turned to the war table and became, entirely, the Empress again, and said, "Now, show me Schneider's 3 points. We have an offensive to break, and I'd like the plan finalized before your family's petition gives me a headache." I will not pretend my hands were entirely steady as I pulled up the northern front. We'll have to discuss it, properly, after the war. The Empress of Aurelia had just told her disowned, penniless, struck from the name Marshal, that the question of the imperial consort was, once the war was won, going to be a conversation between the two of us. And my family, at that exact moment, was somewhere across the city, planning a wedding between Landon and that same woman. The application came that afternoon. It arrived in my office through the proper administrative channels, exactly as Felix had predicted, flagged for review by the office of the Grand Marshal because it referenced a throne-sealed record. Lineage merit transfer. Case number stamped in red. Applicant, Landon Duncan Vance. Source record, sealed. Authority of the throne. Reviewing officer, Grand Marshal, Aurelian forces. And at the bottom, the little box. Approve, deny. I sat at my desk and looked at it for a long time. My brother had laughed in my face at the officers' club and told me he'd gotten my medals after all, that the family had found a way around me once I was disowned, that the estate had reverted my service record and signed it over to him. And he had believed it. They had all believed it, because their lawyers had filed the transfer and gotten a confirmation that the application had been received and was under review, and they'd taken under review to mean approved. And Landon had spent 6 weeks telling the entire capital he was already a general. But the application had never been approved. It couldn't be. It had been sitting in a queue, moving at the exact natural speed I'd ordered, until it reached the only desk in the Empire with the authority to rule on it. Mine. I picked up my pen, the heavy black pen the Empress had given me when she made me Marshal, the one I used to sign orders that moved armies. And I looked at the little box, approve or deny, and I thought about a 13-year-old boy on a transport to Coldfell, watching the capital shrink behind him, being sent away to die so this exact brother could have an easier path. I thought about Alara Blackwood sitting down next to Landon and taking his hand. I thought about my father's voice, "You are no son of mine," and Seraphina's poisonous smile, and Landon's high, ugly laugh in the dark, "Enjoy the ditch." And then I thought about the men. The real soldiers, on the real border, 5 weeks from the worst war in 3 centuries, whose lives would depend on the judgment of their commanders. I thought about what it would mean to put a soft, fraudulent golden boy in command of fighting men on the eve of that war, just to satisfy a family's vanity. And I understood that this signature wasn't really about my revenge at all. The revenge was a gift the situation happened to include. The signature was about the men who'd die if I got it wrong. There was only one possible answer. There had always been only one. I marked the box. Deny. And then, because a denial of a throne-sealed transfer required a written finding from the reviewing officer, I wrote, in my own hand, in the heavy black ink, the finding that would land on my father's breakfast table within the week, and detonate the entire Vance family's 300-year name. Transfer denied. Source record is sealed under throne authority and is not eligible for lineage transfer, inheritance, or assignment under any provision of imperial law. The applicant, Landon Duncan Vance, possesses no combat record, no command qualification, and no lawful claim to the cited merits, which belong to the holder of the Grand Marshal's seal and cannot be transferred to any person for any reason. Furthermore, the applicant's pending promotion to Brigadier General, predicated entirely on this fraudulent transfer, is hereby suspended pending review of how a candidate with no combat record and no lawful merit was advanced to a flag officer board on the eve of war. Finding entered by the Grand Marshal of the Aurelian Empire, whose name the applicant and his family will be interested to learn is on the sealed source record they attempted to plunder. I signed it. And I sat back, and I looked at the war glowing red on the northern border, and I let myself feel for just one moment the full weight of what I just set in motion. In a few days, a courier from Central Command would arrive at the Vance estate with an official finding from the office of the Grand Marshal. My father would open it expecting a confirmation of his son's promotion, and he would read instead that the merits Landon had stolen belonged to the Grand Marshal personally, that the transfer was a fraud, that Landon's promotion was suspended and under investigation, and that the name on the sealed record, the name of the most powerful soldier in the Empire, was a name he would recognize, because it was the name he'd thrown out into the dark. Twice. "Felix," I said into the intercom, "the Landon Vance finding is signed. Route it to the estate through normal courier, no expedite, no flag. Let it arrive on an ordinary morning." I set down the heavy black pen. "And alert the Northern Command. I'm flying to the front tomorrow. The Volthans are nearly ready, and I want eyes on Schneider's positions myself before this thing starts." I looked out at my city. The family can stew on the finding while I go win the war. By the time I come back, they'll have had time to fully understand what they did. And then, the cold fell calm settled over me, complete and patient and absolute. And then we'll see who's enjoying the ditch. That night, after I signed the denial that would detonate my family, I couldn't sleep, and I did the thing I do when I can't sleep, which is go down to the strategic archive at Central Command and look at the maps of Coldfell. Because to understand why I gave up a fortune without a flicker of regret, you have to understand the ridge. You have to understand the 19 days. You have to understand what the ditch actually made, and why a man who has held that ridge cannot be bought by anything a family has to offer. Let me take you there, to the worst and best thing I ever did, to the place my family thinks is a synonym for failure, and which is, in fact, the foundation of everything I am. 3 years ago, before I was Marshal, before the Empress knew my name, I was a major commanding a frontier battalion on the Northern Range, the unwanted son in the unwanted posting, and the Volthon Confederacy launched the offensive that history would forget because of how it ended, an offensive aimed at the Coldfell approaches, the gateway to the whole Northern Front. The plan, then as now, was to break through where Aurelia was weakest, and Aurelia was weakest at Coldfell, because Coldfell was where the Empire sent the soldiers it didn't value, commanded by the officers it had given up on. The Volthans knew this. They aimed their hammer at what they thought was the Empire's softest point. They did not know that the Empire's softest point had spent 7 years being commanded by a man who'd been thrown away, and who had quietly, without anyone in the capital noticing or caring, turned his forgotten frontier battalion into the hardest fighting force in the Aurelian military. Because when you command the men nobody wants, on the border nobody watches, you learn that the only thing that will keep you and your soldiers alive is to be better than everyone believes you can be. I had spent 7 years making the unwanted men of Coldfell into something the Empire didn't know it had. And when the Volthan hammer came down, it came down on us. The line broke on the first day. Not my line, the lines around me, the soft commands on either flank, the political officers who ran when the Volthans hit them. They broke, and they ran, and they left my battalion alone on a ridge above the Coldfell approaches, with both flanks open and the entire weight of a Volthan army corps turning to pour through the gap. The proper military decision, the one every manual taught, the one the fleeing officers on my flanks had made, was to withdraw. To pull back, save the battalion, and let the North collapse in good order. Every regulation in the Empire said retreat. I looked at the map, at the ridge, at the Coldfell approaches behind me, and the whole northern front behind that, and I understood something the regulations didn't account for. If I retreated, the Valthan Corps would be through the gap and into the open country behind the range within 2 days. And once they were in the open, nothing in the soft south could stop them. And the war was lost. Not the battle, the war. The whole empire. The ridge was the cork in the bottle. And the only way to keep the cork in the bottle was to hold a position that could not be held, with a force a quarter the size of the enemy's, with both flanks open, against an army corps, for as long as it took the Empire to wake up and send help that might never come. So I held it. 19 days. I'm not going to glorify it because there's nothing glorious about 19 days on a frozen ridge, watching men you've commanded for 7 years die in the snow, running out of ammunition and then food and then, very nearly, hope. But I'll tell you how we did it, because it's the answer to every question anyone has ever asked about who I am. We did it by being better than the enemy at the one thing the enemy couldn't learn from a manual, the ground. I knew that ridge. I'd patrolled every fold of it for 7 years. I knew where the snow drifted deep enough to swallow a tank, and where the rock would channel an assault into a killing ground, and where a single squad could hold a pass that should have needed a company, and where the wind came down off the heights hard enough to blind an attacker at the exact hour of dawn when they'd attack. The Valthan Corps had numbers, and supply, and every advantage of force. And I had 19 days of using ground I knew better than they knew their own plan to make every one of their advantages cost them 10 times what it should have. I held passes with squads and made the enemy pay battalions to take them. I let positions fall and then took them back at the hour when the wind blinded the new defenders. I moved my dwindling force across that ridge in the dark like a ghost, appearing where the Valthans thought I couldn't be, vanishing before they could bring their numbers to bear, until the enemy commander, a good general facing what he thought was a quarter-strength frontier battalion, became convinced he was facing a force 3 times my actual size, because nothing else could explain how a broken battalion was bleeding his corps white on a ridge that should have fallen in an afternoon. The Valthans started calling me Shadow, because they never saw me until their men were already dying, and the name traveled back across their lines and then, somehow, across ours. And by the 10th day, the frontier soldiers of the whole northern range, the unwanted men, the forgotten ones, were whispering it too. That there was a major on the Coldfell Ridge who would not break, who held a line that could not be held, who was buying the Empire its life one frozen day at a time with a battalion that should have been dead a week ago. On the 19th day, the Valthan offensive culminated. The enemy commander, having lost a third of his corps to a ridge he could not take, committed everything to one final assault to overrun us before the Empire could react. And we were nearly finished. Out of almost everything, the battalion bled down to a fraction of a fraction, and I made the decision that turned the whole war, the decision that looked like madness and was, in fact, Coldfell. Instead of digging in to die, I gathered everything I had left, and I counterattacked, into the seam between the 2 assaulting Valthan regiments, at the dawn hour when the wind came down off the heights and blinded them, the move I would use again 3 years later to save the eastern flank, the Coldfell move, the move that wins by doing the one thing the enemy is certain you're too weak to do. The seam split. The 2 regiments, blinded and surprised and certain they were facing a fresh force, fell back from each other, and the cohesion of the whole assault collapsed. And the Valthan Corps that had spent 19 days failing to take a ridge from a broken battalion broke instead and ran. And the offensive that should have destroyed the Empire died in the snow below the Coldfell Ridge. That was when the Empress found me. She'd flown to the front against her entire court, a sovereign of 90 days who'd refused to write off the north, and she came up onto that ridge in the cold dawn with the Valthan Corps still routing below us. And she found a major standing in the wreckage of a battalion that had held the unholdable line for 19 days, filthy and bleeding and barely upright, surrounded by the survivors of the unwanted men who'd just saved the Empire. And she didn't see a frontier major. She saw the sword the Empire had been throwing away for years, on this exact ridge, in these exact forgotten men. And she pinned a star to my collar that no one else in the Empire wore, and she made the unwanted son of a family that had sent him here to die into the Grand Marshal of the Aurelian Empire, on the ground where he'd been forged. So when you ask me why I gave up a billion-dollar fortune without a flicker of regret, when you ask me why I didn't even have to think about it when my father offered me everything to sign my record over to Landon, here is the answer. I have stood on the Coldfell Ridge on the 19th day. I have held a line that could not be held with men the Empire threw away, and watched them become legends in the snow. I have been weighed in the only scale that has ever mattered, the scale of whether you break or hold when everyone has given you up for dead. And I did not break. And a man who has not broken on the Coldfell Ridge cannot be bought by a fortune, cannot be wounded by a disowning, cannot be diminished by a family's contempt, because he already knows exactly what he's worth. And he learned it in a place where the price was paid in the only currency that's real. My family offered me money and a name. I had already been offered the ridge, and I had paid for it in blood and frost and 19 days, and I had earned something money cannot buy, and a name cannot confer, and a family cannot give or take away. I had earned myself. The true, tested, unbreakable knowledge of exactly who I am when everything is stripped away and the line is breaking and there is no one coming to help. That's what the ditch made. That's what they thought they were throwing away when they sent a 13-year-old boy to Coldfell to die. They thought they were discarding a problem. They were forging a sword. And the sword would come back, 3 years after the ridge, into a warm dining room where soft people who had never been tested offered it a fortune to hand its earned self to a golden boy who had never bled for anything. And the sword would smile and say no, and walk out into the dark it had already conquered once, free. I closed the Coldfell maps in the strategic archive, and I went back up to my office, and I looked at the denial I'd signed, the little box marked deny, and the finding that would land on my father's table and end his certainty forever. And I felt, finally, the deep, clean peace of a man who has nothing left to prove and never did. Because the proving was finished 3 years ago, on a frozen ridge, in front of the only witness whose judgment ever mattered, and her name was the Empire, and she had pinned a star to my collar and called me her sword. Let my family keep the fortune. Let them keep the name and the house and the dead generals on the wall. They had never stood on the ridge. They would never understand that everything they valued was the currency of people who'd never been tested, and that the only wealth that survives the breaking of the line is the wealth I'd carried out of Coldfell in my own chest, untransferable, unsaleable, mine. The war was coming. The reckoning was coming. And I was ready for both, the way I'd been ready for 19 days in the snow, because the ridge had already taught me the only lesson a man ever really needs. You hold. When everyone says you can't, when everyone has given you up, when both your flanks are open and the line is breaking and there is no help coming, you hold. And if you hold long enough, the dawn comes, and the wind comes down off the heights, and you counterattack into the seam, and you win. I had held for 19 days against an army. I could certainly hold against a family. I wasn't at the Vance estate when the finding arrived, but I've reconstructed that morning so many times from so many sources, the household staff, the courier's log, my father's own eventual confession, that I can see it as clearly as if I'd been standing in the breakfast room. And I want to tell it properly because some moments deserve to be told properly, and a family learning that the son they threw away owns the army is one of them. It was an ordinary morning. Serafina was planning the engagement gala and the wedding that would bind them to the throne, both at once, drunk on ambition. Landon was sleeping off a celebration because he'd been celebrating for 6 weeks. My father was reading the military gazette over coffee, content, a man who believed he had finally arranged his family the way he wanted it, the inconvenient son gone, the golden son ascendant, the throne itself within reach. And a courier from Central Command arrived with an official envelope bearing the seal of the office of the Grand Marshal, and my father took it without much interest, because the office of the Grand Marshal handled all flag officer matters, and he assumed it was the confirmation of Landon's promotion, the final stamp on the family's triumph. He opened it at the table. He read the first line, and the staff say he went very still, and then very pale, and then he read it again, and then a third time. And then he stood up so fast his chair fell over, and he said in a voice none of them had ever heard from him, a voice with fear in it. "This is wrong. This has to be wrong. Get me the staff lawyer. Now!" Because my father, alone of all of them, understood at least part of what he was reading. Serafina saw only that the promotion was suspended and screamed about sabotage. Landon, dragged from his bed, saw only that his stars were being taken and raged about jealousy. But my father had 40 years in the military, and he read the words, "Source record is sealed under throne authority," and he knew, with the cold professional knowledge of a career general, exactly what that meant. There is only one record in the entire Aurelian military sealed under throne authority. He had spent 40 years knowing that such a seal existed and never once expecting to see it, the way a man knows the sun exists and never expects to hold it. A throne-sealed record belonged to one person and one position, the Grand Marshal. And the findings said that the merits Landon had tried to steal belonged to the holder of that seal, which meant the service record of Ethan Vance, the disowned ditch major, the nameless beggar, was sealed under the authority of the throne, which meant the obscure frontier ribbons my father had tried to harvest for Landon were not ribbons at all, which meant his first son, the one he'd sent to Coldfell to die, the one he'd disowned over a few medals, was. My father did not let himself finish the thought. He told me later that he refused to finish it for almost an hour because finishing it was unsurvivable. He had the staff lawyer pull every record they could legally reach, and every one of them came back the same. Authority sealed by order of the throne. A wall of black text where his eldest son's life should have been. A wall that only one office in the empire could see behind. And finally, when there was nothing left to check and no comfortable lie left to hide in, my father sat down at the head of the table where 6 weeks earlier he'd told a man he was no son of his, and he made the call that he had spent 40 years never imagining he would have to make. He called Central Command, and he identified himself as General Duncan Vance of the 3rd Territorial Army, and he asked the duty officer to confirm the identity of the current Grand Marshal of the Aurelian Empire. And the duty officer, following the exact protocol I had personally written, said, "General Vance, the identity of the Grand Marshal is a matter of state security and is not disclosed over open channels. However, your 3rd Territorial Army has just received mobilization orders. The Volthan Confederacy crossed the northern border at 0400 this morning. The Empire is at war. By imperial protocol, all army commands now report directly to the Grand Marshal, who has assumed supreme command of all forces. You will receive your orders within the hour, General, from the Marshal's headquarters. In person, the Marshal has requested, given the 3rd Army's strategic importance." A pause. "The Marshal looks forward to commanding you personally, sir. He says, and I quote, that he has wanted the chance to command the 3rd Army for a very long time." The war had come. 5 weeks early. Schneider had moved faster than even I expected, and the largest Volthan offensive in 3 centuries was pouring across the northern range at 3 points, exactly as I'd predicted. And the Empire was mobilizing for survival, and every army command in Aurelia, including my father's, was now, by the law I'd helped write, under the absolute authority of the Grand Marshal. And my father, holding the phone in the wreckage of his certainty, finally let himself finish the thought he'd been refusing for an hour. His disowned son. The throne seal. The Marshal who'd just taken supreme command. The Marshal who had wanted the chance to command the 3rd Army for a very long time. The Marshal who looked forward to commanding General Vance personally. The staff say my father set down the phone with a hand that shook and sat in his chair for a long time without speaking. And when Serafina demanded to know what was happening, what the lawyers had found, why he looked like a dead man, he said only one thing, very quietly, the truth landing on him all at once with the full weight of 15 years. We sent him to Coldfell to die, and he became the sword of the Empire. And in 1 hour, I have to report to my own son, who I disowned, for refusing to give his brother the medals that were actually the command of the entire army. He looked up at his wife, his face gray. "Serafina, we didn't throw away a son. We threw away the most powerful man in the Empire. And then we petitioned to marry his brother to the Empress he serves." His voice cracked. "Do you understand what we've done? Do you understand what's about to happen to this family?" I was at the Northern Front when the war started, in the Forward Command Center 60 miles behind the lines, and I will not spend long on the military details because the family's humiliation is the story you came for. But I want you to understand that the war was real, and the stakes were real, and the reason my revenge tasted as good as it did is that I earned it in the same breath that I won the war. Schneider's plan was good, I'll give him that. 3 simultaneous thrusts to stretch us thin, a feint in the center to draw our reserves, and the real hammer blow in the west, where the southern-trained generals held soft positions. It was the plan of a man who'd studied Coldfell and learned the right lessons, who knew that the Aurelian weakness was political generals in soft commands, and who'd built his entire offensive around hitting them. It was the best plan the Vulthan Confederacy had produced in a century, and I had been planning for it for 3 years. Because here is what Schneider didn't account for, what no enemy of Aurelia had accounted for in 3 years. The Empire's commander was a man who had grown up on this exact border, who had been forged in its frost, who knew every ridge and pass and frozen river the way other men know the rooms of their childhood home, because this border was my childhood home. They'd sent me here to die, and instead I'd spent 15 years learning to hold it, and now the largest army the Vulthans had ever fielded was crossing ground I knew better than its own scouts. Schneider had built a brilliant plan to exploit Aurelia's soft generals. He had not built a plan to fight a marshal who'd been raised in the dirt he was marching across. I let the 3 thrusts come. I let the feint draw exactly as Schneider wanted, except the reserves it drew were a fraction of what he thought. Ghost units, decoys, my own old Coldfell trick of showing the enemy the army he expects to see. And the Western hammer blow, the real one, the master stroke aimed at our softest command, came down on a position that I had, 2 weeks earlier, very quietly reinforced with the hardest troops in the Empire. The frontier divisions, my divisions, the men who'd followed me out of the ditch. Schneider swung his hammer at what he thought was soft southern clay and hit Coldfell steel, and the steel held. And then the steel moved, and within 72 hours the greatest offensive in 3 centuries was not breaking the Aurelian line. It was dying against it. But the war wasn't won in 72 hours. It was just turned, and the turning required every army command in the Empire to perform, including the soft southern ones, including the political generals, including the 3rd Territorial Army of General Duncan Vance, which held a critical position on the eastern flank that the entire counterstroke depended on. If the 3rd Army held, the counterstroke would close like a trap. If the 3rd Army broke, the whole northern front would unravel and the war would be lost. And the 3rd Army reported to me. So on the 3rd day of the war, in the forward command center 60 miles behind the lines, with the fate of the Empire balanced on a knife, I gave the order I had been waiting 15 years to give. I had General Duncan Vance brought to my headquarters to receive his orders in person. I want to describe the command center because it matters. It was carved into a mountain, lit cold and blue, walls of screens showing the whole Northern War in real time, hundreds of staff officers moving with the controlled urgency of people holding an empire together. At the center of it was the command table, and at the head of the command table was a chair, and in that chair sat the Grand Marshal of the Aurelian Empire, in the dress uniform I was finally permitted to wear, the single star at my collar that no other man in the Empire wore, the war I'd designed glowing on the screens around me. And officers 50 years my senior snapped to attention when I spoke, and the whole vast room ran on my word. The doors opened, and a master sergeant escorted in General Duncan Vance, 3 stars, commander of the 3rd Territorial Army, my father, the man who had thrown me out into the dark twice, 15 years apart. He came in at attention because he'd been told to report to the Grand Marshal, and a general reports to the Marshal at attention no matter what. But he came in with his eyes down, the way you approach a power so far above you that you don't dare look at it directly, the habit of 40 years of military hierarchy. And then he reached the command table, and he raised his eyes to look at the supreme commander of all Aurelian forces, the man who held his army and his empire and his life in his hands, the marshal he had been ordered to report to in person. And he looked into my face. I watched it happen. I watched 40 years of certainty and 15 years of cruelty and 6 weeks of ambition collapse all at once behind my father's eyes. I watched General Duncan Vance, in front of 300 staff officers, in the command center at the heart of the greatest war of his life, look up to receive his orders from the supreme commander of the Empire, and find himself looking at the son he'd sent to die. The disowned son, the ditch major, the nameless beggar. wearing the single star of the Grand Marshal, sitting at the head of the war, holding the fate of the Third Army and the Empire and Duncan Vance himself in one hand. My father's mouth opened. No sound came out. His face went white, then gray, and his legs, I saw it, his legs actually buckled slightly. A three-star general nearly going down in front of his own troops before he caught himself on the edge of the table. And he stared at me with an expression I had waited my entire life to see on that face. An expression I had stopped believing I would ever see. The expression of a man understanding, fully and finally and far too late, exactly what he had thrown away. "Ethan," he whispered. Not General, not Marshal, Ethan. The name he'd struck from the family register 6 weeks ago. You're the Grand Marshal of the Aurelian Empire, I said. My voice was calm, level, carrying across the silent command center, the voice I used to move armies. Supreme commander of all imperial forces, the holder of the throne seal, the owner of the sealed service record you tried to harvest for your other son. I let the words fall into the absolute silence of 300 officers who had all just understood that they were watching something extraordinary. You're standing at attention in front of me, General, because the law requires it. The law you spent 40 years serving. The same law that sent a 13-year-old boy to Coldfell to die because his father found him inconvenient. I rose from the chair, slowly, and came around the command table to stand in front of the father who had thrown me away. And I watched him have to look up at me now, the way I'd had to look up at him my whole childhood. You told me 6 weeks ago that I was no son of yours. You told me I'd walk out with nothing, and then you sent me a finding to confirm my brother's stolen promotion, and instead you learned that the ditch you threw me into made the most powerful soldier in the Empire. I held his eyes. I told you, Father, at the table. I told you the Empire would need its sword, and that every general in Aurelia would kneel to one man. You laughed. Landon laughed. You told me to enjoy the ditch. The command center was so silent I could hear the screens humming. Well, I said, here we are. The Empire needs its sword, and the Third Army needs its orders, and the man giving them is the son you threw into the dark. I turned and walked back to the head of the war, to the chair that commanded an empire, and I sat, and I looked down at General Duncan Vance, standing rigid and gray and broken at the foot of the command table. So let's find out, General, whether your soldiers are better than your judgment, because in about 6 hours, the survival of the Aurelian Empire is going to depend on whether the Third Territorial Army can hold the eastern flank. And I am about to give you the orders that will decide it. Stand up straight, General Vance. The cold fell calm, absolute and patient and 15 years in the making. You're receiving orders from the Marshal now. The least you can do after everything is hold the line for me the way I held it for you when you'd already given me up for dead. My father held the line. I'll say that for him, and it's the only good thing I have to say about Duncan Vance. But it's not nothing, and I'm a man who believes in giving even his enemies their due. The battle for the eastern flank was the hinge of the whole war, and for 11 hours it hung by a thread. The Third Territorial Army was not a frontier command. It was a soft southern army full of political officers and parade ground discipline, and when the Volthan Reserve Corps came down on its positions in the gray dawn of the fourth day, the soft parts started to give. I watched it from the command center, the eastern flank flickering amber and then red on the great screens, a regiment wavering here, a battalion pulling back there, the slow, terrible beginning of a rout. And I understood that the Third Army was going to break, not because the soldiers were cowards, but because they'd been led for 40 years by a man who confused fear for respect and parade ground polish for combat readiness. And you cannot install in 11 hours what should have been built over 40 years. So I did the only thing I could do. I commanded the Third Army directly through my father in real time for 11 hours straight. I want to describe this because it was the strangest and most important conversation of my life. For 11 hours, over the command channel, the disowned son gave orders to the father who'd thrown him away, and the father executed them, because the alternative was the death of the Empire. I told him where to shift his reserves before he saw the threat, because I knew this ground, this exact ground, the eastern range above the Coldfell approaches. I'd patrolled it as a cadet. I'd bled on it as a major. I knew every fold of it the way Schneider's scouts never could. I told him which positions to abandon and which to die for. I told him at the critical moment when his instinct was to consolidate and hold, to instead counterattack into the seam between two Volthan cores, a move that looked insane on the map and was, in fact, the exact move that won Coldfell. And my father, to his eternal credit, did not argue. He had spent 6 weeks and 1 war learning what his soldiers had learned in 11 hours, that the voice on the command channel knew things no map could show. And he executed the impossible counterattack. And the seam split, and the Volthan Reserve Corps that should have shattered the eastern flank found itself flanked instead, and broke. And somewhere in those 11 hours, something happened between us that I had not planned and did not expect. My father stopped being broken and started being a soldier. I heard it in his voice over the channel, the gray collapse of the command center burning away under the heat of the work, and by the 8th hour he wasn't General Vance reporting to the son he'd ruined. He was a field commander fighting for his men under a marshal he'd finally, fully understood. He executed my orders with a precision and a courage I'd never imagined he had, exposing himself at the front, rallying wavering units in person, doing, at 58 years old, on the worst day of his life, the actual job of a general, maybe for the first time. And when the eastern flank finally held, when the counterattack closed the trap and the Volthan offensive's eastern arm collapsed and the screens went from red back to amber, back, slowly, to blue, my father came up on the private command channel, just the two of us, his voice ragged with exhaustion and something else, and he said, "Marshal, the eastern flank is secure. The Third Army holds." A long pause, the sound of a battlefield going quiet behind him. "Ethan, I don't have any right to say anything to you that isn't an order or a report. I know that. So I'll just say the report. The Third Army holds, sir, because of your command. Every man on this flank is alive tonight because the son I threw away told me how to save them. I'll spend whatever's left of my life understanding what that means. That's not an excuse. There's no excuse. It's just..." His voice broke, a 3-star general weeping on a command channel after 11 hours of battle. "It's just the report, sir. The line holds. Thank you for not letting my men die for my mistakes. You'd have had every right." And I sat at the head of the war, and I found that the thing I felt was not triumph. I'd expected triumph. I'd waited 15 years for the moment my father would understand, and now he understood, completely. And the triumph wasn't there. What was there was tired and complicated and human. The recognition that my father was a bad father, and it turned out, when a marshal told him exactly what to do, a brave soldier, and that both of those were true at once, and that the world is full of people who are the worst thing they did, and also sometimes capable of more. "Acknowledged, General," I said. "The line holds. Get your men fed and your wounded back. We're not done. But you bought us the eastern flank, and tonight that's everything." I paused, and then, because I am not a man who lies even to wound, I gave him the only thing I had that was true. "You fought well today, Father. Better than I knew you could. Remember that you were capable of this. Whatever else comes, you held the eastern flank for the Empire when it mattered. That's real. Now do your job and let me do mine." I cut the channel before either of us could ruin it by saying more. There would be a reckoning between Duncan Vance and me, a long one, but it would not happen on a command channel in the middle of a war, and it would not erase 15 years, and it would not be simple. But the eastern flank held, and the Empire would live, and my father had become, for 11 hours, the soldier he should have spent 40 years being. I would take it. It was more than I'd expected, and less than I'd dreamed, which is, I've found, what most things turn out to be. But the war was not over, and the most dangerous part of it had nothing to do with Schneider's corps. Because on the 5th day, as the Volthan offensive collapsed all along the front and victory began, impossibly, to look certain, Felix came to me in the command center with a face like a closed door and a data slate that changed everything. "Sir," he said quietly, pulling me aside from the staff, "Schneider's plan was too good." I waited. Felix never wasted words and never alarmed me without cause. "I've been analyzing the offensive. The 3 thrusts, the feint, the western hammer blow aimed precisely at our softest commands. It was built on intelligence, sir. Detailed, current, specific intelligence about exactly which Aurelian commands were soft and which were hard, which generals were political and which were combat-ready, where our reserves were and weren't. Schneider knew our internal command structure better than half our own war college. He set the slate down. He had a source, a high one, someone with access to the Imperial military's internal readiness assessments and the court's political map. Someone who told the Volthan Confederacy exactly where and when to strike for maximum collapse. His eyes were hard. Sir, the only reason Schneider's brilliant plan failed is that it was built around hitting soft commands, and you'd quietly hardened the one position it mattered at, 2 weeks before the war, on an instinct you couldn't even fully explain to me at the time. If you hadn't, the Western hammer blow lands on actual soft clay and the front collapses on day one. We didn't win because the plan was bad. We won because you got lucky on one decision against a plan that was fed by a traitor. The command center seemed to go cold around me. A source, a high one, access to internal readiness assessments and the court's political map. The kind of access held by very few people in the empire, the senior military command, the imperial court, the great noble houses with their fingers in both. The consort faction, I said slowly. The faction pressuring the Empress to marry. The faction my stepmother allied the Vance family to. They have court access and they've spent 2 years trying to destabilize the Empress's hold on power. I felt the shape of it assembling, cold and ugly and complete. Felix, what if the petition wasn't really about marrying Landon to the Empress at all? What if the marriage was never the point? What if the point was to create a political crisis at court, to align a major army command with the destabilization faction, to weaken the Empire's internal cohesion in the exact weeks before a Volthan offensive that the faction's leader knew was coming, because the faction's leader was the source? I looked at him. Someone in that faction has been feeding Schneider, and they used the consort crisis as cover, as a distraction, as a way to tangle one of our 4 armies into court politics right before the war. The petition to marry my brother to the Empress wasn't ambition, or it wasn't only ambition. It was an operation, and my family walked into it like sheep, because Serafina's greed made them the perfect, useful idiots, a respectable old military family to give the faction's treason a patriotic face. Felix nodded grimly. I think someone played your stepmother, sir. Dangled the throne in front of her ambition, used the Vance name and the Third Army's political weight to strengthen the faction, and timed the whole crisis to the offensive. Your family didn't just throw away their most powerful son and insult their Empress. They got recruited, without knowing it, into a treason that nearly cost us the war. He pulled up a list of names. The consort faction has a leader, the man who's organized the marriage pressure campaign for 2 years, who endorsed the Vance petition, who has the court access and the military clearances and the personal grievance against the Empress to do all of it. He highlighted one name. Duke Calder, master of the Imperial Court's Protocol Office, which gives him access to every readiness assessment and political map in the Empire, old enemy of the Sterling dynasty, and the man who personally walked Serafina Vance's petition through the court. His jaw tightened. If I'm right, sir, Calder is Schneider's source. Calder is the traitor who nearly sold the Empire to the Volthans, and your family is, right now, this minute, politically and publicly allied to him, with their name on his petition, in the middle of a war he helped start. I stood at the head of the command center, the war I'd won glowing blue around me, and I understood that the story wasn't over at all. The military war was ending, but a second war, a quieter and more dangerous one, was just coming into focus. A war of treason and court politics, and my family was standing in the worst possible position in it, allied by their own greed to the man who'd betrayed the Empire. The finding I'd signed had already destroyed Landon's stolen promotion. The war had already broken my father and remade him for 11 hours. But the consort petition, the thing Serafina had been proudest of, her reach for the throne, was about to become the thing that didn't just humiliate the Vance family, but implicated them in treason against the crown. And the only person who could save them from that, if they deserved saving, if I decided they deserved saving, was the disowned son they'd thrown into the dark. Felix, I said, build the case on Calder, quietly, completely, airtight. I want every communication, every clearance access, every link between his protocol office and Volthan intelligence. We're not going to accuse a duke of treason in wartime without proof that buries him past any defense. I turned toward the screens, toward the capital, toward the court where the second war was waiting. And get me a secure channel to the Empress. She needs to know that the man pressuring her to marry, the man whose faction her own court can't ignore, has been selling the empire to Schneider. And she needs to know that the Vance family's petition is the thread that, pulled correctly, unravels the whole treason. The cold fell calm, but sharper now, because this was no longer about my family's vanity. This was about the empire, and the woman who held it, and a traitor who'd nearly killed us all. We won the war on the border, Felix. Now we go win the one at court. And this time, when the Vance family learns what they've done, it won't be a finding on a breakfast table. It'll be the difference between whether they're remembered as fools or as traitors. I thought of my father, weeping on the command channel after 11 hours of holding the line. I thought of him fighting bravely for his men under my command, becoming, too late, the soldier he should have been. And I thought about how he was, at this very moment, legally and publicly allied to a man who'd betrayed the empire he'd just bled to defend, and how he didn't even know it, and how the same greed that had thrown me into the dark had now walked his whole family to the edge of a treason charge. The war on the border was won. The war for my family's fate, and the empire's, was about to begin. And at the center of it, holding all the threads, the sword and the secret and the proof and the power, was the son who had nothing, who had walked out into the dark with a sealed record and a plain coat, and come back holding the empire in his hand. I came back to the capital 8 days later as the man who'd won the war, and the Empress chose to reveal me to the empire on the steps of the imperial palace, in front of the entire court and every camera in Aurelia. And I will not pretend it wasn't the sweetest public moment of my life, because it was, and a man should be honest about these things. For 3 years, my identity had been a state secret, the Grand Marshal known to the Empire only as a name without a face, Marshal Vance, the Sword of Aurelia, the Ghost of Coldfell. The capital had spent 8 days delirious with victory, the largest Vulthan offensive in 3 centuries shattered, the Empire saved, and the city wanted to see the face of the man who'd done it. And so the Empress, who understood spectacle the way she understood everything, summoned the court and the cameras to the palace steps for the formal victory address, and she stood at the top of those steps in the imperial regalia, the Winter Queen, and she said to the empire and the world, "For 3 years, the Sword of Aurelia has had no face, only a name. Today, with the enemy broken and the empire safe, I give you the man who held the line when others fled, who was forged on the frontier this empire forgot, who designed the victory that saved us all. I give you the youngest Grand Marshal in 600 years. I give you the truth my court has whispered about and never seen." She turned, and she extended her hand toward me, and I climbed the palace steps in the dress uniform with the single star, and the cameras found my face, and the Empress said, in a voice that carried across the whole capital, "Marshal Ethan Vance, the Sword of the Throne, and the man to whom every soldier in Aurelia, every general, every noble, and every house owes the survival of this empire." Ethan Vance. The name detonated across the capital in real time, because the capital knew that name. The capital had spent 6 weeks gossiping about the Vance family, about the golden boy Landon and his stolen promotion, and his engagement to Alara Blackwood, and his stepmother's audacious petition to marry him to the Empress. And the capital had also heard, in the smaller, meaner whispers, about the other Vance son, the disowned one, the ditch major, the penniless beggar struck from the family register for refusing to give his brother his worthless frontier ribbons. And now, on the palace steps, in front of every camera in the empire, those 2 stories collided, and the entire capital understood, all at once, in a single vertiginous moment, that the disowned, penniless beggar and the youngest Grand Marshal in 600 years were the same man. That the Vance family had thrown away the sword of the empire, that the worthless frontier ribbons had been the command of the entire army, that the golden boy had tried to steal the marshal's stars, and the stepmother had tried to marry the Empress to the marshal's brother, and the whole family had publicly, comprehensively, on the record, thrown away and insulted and tried to plunder the most powerful soldier in Aurelia, who had then gone and won the greatest war in 300 years. Somewhere in the crowd at the foot of those steps, I knew, My family was watching. I'd made sure of it. The victory address required the attendance of all noble houses, and the Vance family was still, for a few more days at least, a noble house. So they stood in the crowd, my father and Seraphina and Landon and Alara, and they watched the Empress of Aurelia present the disowned son to the Empire as its savior and its sword. And they watched the entire capital turn, in a single moment, to stare at them, the family that had thrown him away. I found them in the crowd from the top of the steps. It wasn't hard. They were the still point in a sea of cheering, 4 faces frozen in dawning catastrophe, and I let my eyes rest on them, just for a moment, long enough that the cameras followed my gaze, and the whole empire saw the Marshal look at the family that had disowned him. And then I turned back to the Empress and the business of the victory, and I left them standing there in the wreckage of their own story, on every screen in Aurelia. They came to me that evening. Of course they came. There was nothing else left for them to do. I received them in my official residence, a thing I had not had 6 weeks earlier when I was letting them believe I was nothing. A state residence appropriate to the Grand Marshal, with guards at the gate who had fought under me and would have died for me, and a study lined with the maps of the war I'd won. I had them shown in, and I did not rise, and I did not offer them seats, and I let them stand in front of my desk the way I had stood in front of my father's table 6 weeks ago, and I looked at them, the family that had thrown me into the dark, and I waited. My father looked 10 years older. The war had aged him, and the revelation had hollowed him, and he stood at a kind of broken attention, a soldier who no longer knew if he had the right. Seraphina's composure had cracked into something desperate and ugly. The furs were gone, the poisoned smile was gone, and underneath was just a frightened, ambitious woman who'd finally reached too far. Landon looked like a child who'd been slapped, the golden boy's confidence shattered into sullen disbelief. And Alara Blackwood, who had no right to be there at all, who had jilted me 3 years ago and called me a dead-end major, stood slightly apart, and her eyes did the old calculation, the one I'd watched her do at a dinner table 3 years ago, except now the calculation had a different answer, and I watched her arrive at it in real time. It was Seraphina who broke first, because greed always breaks first. "Ethan," she said, and her voice was trembling with the effort of warmth she didn't feel. "Marshal, we didn't know. You have to understand, we never knew. If we'd had any idea what you'd become, we would never have. The disowning was a terrible misunderstanding. Your father was upset. We all say things, but family is family, and surely now that everything's, we can put it behind us. We can be a family again. The petition was a mistake. I see that now. I only ever wanted what was best. You must believe." "Stop," I said. Not loudly. I never had to be loud anymore. The word cut her off like a blade, and she flinched. "You're going to want to be very careful about what you say in this room, Seraphina, and I'll explain why. Because you don't understand your situation. None of you do. And your situation is far worse than disowning the Marshal." I leaned forward. "Let me tell you what you actually did. You didn't just throw away your most powerful son and try to steal his stars and petition to marry his brother to the woman he serves. Those were the small crimes, the vanity crimes, the ones that only make you fools." I let the silence stretch. "Your petition to marry Landon to the Empress was endorsed and walked through the court by Duke Calder. And Duke Calder, as the imperial investigation will make public within days, is the traitor who sold this empire's military secrets to the Volthon Confederacy, who fed Schneider the intelligence that built the offensive that nearly destroyed us, who used the consort marriage crisis as cover for a treason operation timed to the war." I watched the blood drain from 4 faces. "And your family, by your own greed, is publicly, formally, on the record allied to him. Your name is on his petition. Your father's army was politically aligned to his faction. You made the Vance name the patriotic face of a traitor's operation. So you didn't come here tonight to reconcile with the brother who got lucky. You came here, though you didn't know it until this moment, to find out whether the Marshal you threw away is going to let your entire family be tried for treason alongside the Duke." The study was silent. Landon made a small sound. Seraphina had gone white as bone. And my father closed his eyes, and I watched him understand the full architecture of what his family's greed had built. And I watched the last of him break. "You walked into Calder's operation like sheep," I continued, because your greed made you the perfect tool. He dangled the throne in front of Seraphina's ambition, and she grabbed it, and she dragged the whole family into a treason she was too greedy to see. That's the truth. And here's the situation that truth creates. I am the Grand Marshal. The investigation into Calder runs through my office and the Empress's authority. I can present your family as knowing co-conspirators, in which case the Vance name ends, the estate is forfeit, and you, father, are tried alongside the Duke for the treason your wife allied you to. Or I can present your family as Calder's unwitting dupes, manipulated by a traitor who exploited your ambition, in which case you're merely the most humiliated noble house in the Empire's history, stripped of influence, your name a byword for greed and folly, but alive and free. I sat back. The difference between those two outcomes, between treason and mere disgrace, between the executioner and the history books, is entirely my recommendation. The recommendation of the sun you threw into the dark, twice. I let them feel the full weight of it, the complete reversal. 6 weeks ago, my father had stood at the head of his table and held my entire future in his hands and chosen to throw it away. Now I sat at the head of my own and held all of theirs, their freedom, their name, their lives. And they understood, finally, completely, what it was to be the one standing in front of the desk, waiting to learn your fate from someone who owes you nothing. It was Ilara who couldn't bear it. Ilara, who had no stake in the family's survival, who was only engaged to Landon, who had jilted me 3 years ago, stepped forward, and her face had rearranged itself into something soft and pleading and beautiful, the old weapons deployed now in a desperate new direction. "Ethan," she said, and her voice was honey and tears. "Marshal, I made a terrible mistake 3 years ago. I was young and foolish and I couldn't see what was right in front of me. I chose Landon when I should have seen, when anyone should have seen, that you were always the better man, the stronger man, I'm not engaged to Landon in my heart. I never was. It was an arrangement. Surely you of all people understand arrangements. And now that I see who you truly are, it's not too late for us. I looked at Ilara Blackwood, who had sat down next to my brother 3 years ago and taken his hand and called me a dead-end major in front of 2 families, and who was now offering to jilt my brother the same way she'd jilted me the moment the calculation changed, and I felt nothing for her at all. Not anger, not satisfaction, just the clean, cold clarity of a man looking at exactly what someone is. "You're doing it again," I said quietly. "Right now, in front of all of them. You're recalculating. 3 years ago, you ran the numbers and chose Landon because I was a dead-end major and he was going to be a general. Tonight, you've run them again, and the answer changed. So you're ready to leave him in this room and reach for me, with his ring still on your finger." I almost smiled. "Ilara, you've just shown me, in front of my whole family, exactly why I will never spend a single thought on you again. You don't choose people, you choose their positions. And a person who chooses positions will leave you the instant your position changes, which is why you'll end up alone, eventually, with whoever has the most money and the least love, and you'll deserve every cold minute of it." I turned away from her, dismissing her completely, the cruelest thing you can do to a woman who's only ever been valued for her ability to command attention. "Landon, your fiancé just tried to leave you for your brother, in front of your parents, 30 seconds after learning I had power. I think about what that tells you about the life you stole from me. You took my inheritance and my fiancé and my stars, and look what they're actually worth. A jilting woman and stolen credit, and a fraud that fell apart the moment it touched reality. You took everything I had, brother, and none of it was real. And now you have nothing real either. We're even, in a way. Except I built something true out of the ditch, and you'll spend the rest of your life knowing you couldn't even hold the things you stole." The family stood in the wreckage, and I let them stand there, in the long silence, and I made them wait for the verdict, the way I'd been made to wait my whole life. And then I gave it, because I am not, in the end, my father. And the difference between us is the whole point of this story. "Here's what's going to happen," I said. "I'm going to recommend to the Empress that the Vance family be treated as Calder's unwitting dupes. Not because you deserve mercy, you don't, but because the truth happens to be that you were too stupid and too greedy to know you were committing treason. And I will not lie to my Empress even to damn people who'd have damned me. You'll live. You'll be free. The name survives, barely. But the estate's political influence is finished. The Third Army goes to a commander who earned it, and the Vance name spends the next generation as the Empire's favorite cautionary tale. The family that threw away the Marshal and married its golden boy to a traitor's scheme out of pure greed. I stood finally and came around the desk, and I stopped in front of my father, the man who'd thrown me into the dark, who'd held the eastern flank, who was both of those things at once. And you, Father, you held the line for me when it mattered. You became, for 11 hours, the soldier you should have been for 40 years. So I'm going to give you the one thing you never gave me, a choice. I held his broken eyes. You can spend whatever years you have left as the disgraced patriarch of a ruined house, nursing your wife's ambition and your younger son's resentment. Or you can resign your commission, walk away from the name and the faction and the wreckage, and spend those years trying to become, in private, the man you were for 11 hours on the eastern flank. I won't help you. I won't reconcile with you. 15 years and 6 weeks don't dissolve because you wept on a command channel. But I'm giving you the choice I never got, which is more than you ever gave me, and exactly as much as I'm willing to give. I turned to the door. Guards will show you out, all of you. Don't come to this residence again unless you're summoned. The next time the Vance family appears in my life, it will be because I've decided, not because you've reached for something. You've reached for the last time. Now get out and go live with what you've done. I want to tell you what happened to the capital in the days after the palace steps, because the reversal of an entire society is a thing worth watching, and because my family had spent 15 years being made by that society and were now about to be unmade by it, in public, in real time. The Aurelian capital runs on status the way an engine runs on fuel. Who is rising? Who is falling? Whose name opens doors and whose name closes them? For 15 years, the Vance name had been fuel of the highest grade, an ancient military dynasty, 300 years of dead generals, and the whole machinery of the capital's drawing rooms and clubs and salons had treated the Kanes accordingly, and treated the disowned ditch major's son, on the rare occasions anyone thought of him at all, as a footnote, an embarrassment, a nobody. The society pages had covered Landon's stolen promotion as a triumph. They had covered Ilara's engagement as the match of the season. They had covered Seraphina's petition to marry her son to the Empress as the bold play of an ascendant house. The entire apparatus of capital society had spent 6 weeks celebrating the Vance family's reach for glory, and not one column inch on the brother they'd thrown away. And then the Empress said 2 words on the palace steps, Ethan Vance. And the entire apparatus reversed itself in a single afternoon, with the shameless speed of people who have never had a conviction in their lives that survived a change in who was powerful. By the next morning, the society pages that had celebrated Landon's promotion were running breathless retrospectives on the tragic genius the Vance family had cruelly exiled. The clubs that had laughed at the ditch major were suddenly full of men who'd always sensed something extraordinary about him. The salons that had toasted Ilara's match were now whispering about her shocking cruelty in jilting the Marshal, as though they hadn't all applauded it 3 years ago. The capital, which had spent 15 years agreeing that Ethan Vance was nothing and Landon Vance was everything, reversed both judgments overnight and pretended it had always believed the new ones. And watching it happen taught me more about the worthlessness of social status than 15 years of being denied it ever had. Because I saw, clearly, that the same machinery now elevating me had been wrong about me my entire life, and was only right now because power had changed hands, and would reverse again the instant it changed back. The capital's judgment had never been about truth. It had only ever been about power. And a man who learns that lesson completely is a man who can never again be wounded by society's contempt or seduced by its approval, because he's seen the machine from the inside and knows it measures nothing real. My soldiers, though. My soldiers were different, and the difference is the whole point. While the capital's society reversed itself out of cowardice, the army celebrated out of love, and the two were not the same thing at all, and I have never confused them since. Because the soldiers of Aurelia had not needed the Empress to tell them who I was. The frontier divisions had known for years. The men who'd held the eastern flank knew. The veterans of the Cold Fell Ridge had been telling the story for 3 years to anyone who'd listen. The shadow, the major who wouldn't break, the line that couldn't be held and held anyway. When my identity became public, the army's reaction was not the capital's shocked reversal. It was the deep, satisfied joy of men whose hidden king had finally been crowned in the open, whose private legend had become the empire's public truth. And the celebration in the barracks and the border forts and the veterans' halls was a different thing entirely from the celebration in the salons, because it was real, because it was earned, because those men had bled beside the legend and didn't have to pretend they'd always believed. I went to them, in those days, more than I went to the court. I went to the veterans' halls and the field hospitals and the frontier forts, and I stood with the men who'd held the line. And that was where I actually felt the victory, not on the palace steps, not in the reversing salons, but in a field hospital on the northern range where a young soldier who'd lost a leg holding the eastern flank gripped my hand and said, "I told them, sir. The whole war. I told the new men. The marshal came up through Coldfell. He's one of us. He won't spend us like the southern generals do." And I was right. You held us together from the command center like we were your own blood. And I thought, looking at that boy, about the difference between him and my actual blood. And I understood that I had spent my whole life thinking I'd been deprived of a family, when in fact, I'd had one all along, on the frontier, in the ranks, among the unwanted men who'd become my brothers in the snow, and that the family I'd been born into had been the counterfeit, and the family I'd been forged into was the real one. Ilara Blackwood discovered the cost of the reversal at a society gala 2 weeks after the palace steps, and I heard about it from 3 different sources, because the capital could speak of nothing else. She had attended expecting, I think, to bask in her proximity to the Vance name's sudden new luster, to position herself, with her usual genius for calculation, as the woman who'd been engaged to the Marshal's family, who knew him, who had a claim on the season's great story. She had not understood that the reversal cut both ways, because the same society that now worshipped the Marshal had to find someone to blame for having mistreated him, and a society looking for someone to blame always chooses the person with the least power to fight back. And that person was Ilara, the woman who had famously, publicly jilted the Marshal for his brother, calling him a dead-end major to his face in front of 2 families. The story, which had been a charming anecdote of a sensible girl's good judgment 3 years ago, was now told as a parable of breathtaking cruelty and stupidity, and it was told everywhere, and it was told about her. She walked into that gala and found that the women who'd envied her engagement now used her as a cautionary tale, that the men who'd admired her now found her presence awkward, that the great houses that had courted the Crowleys now had previous engagements. She had become, overnight, the woman who threw away the Marshal, the embodiment of every shallow calculation the capital was now pretending it had never made, the scapegoat society needed so it wouldn't have to blame itself. And she fled that gala in tears, and the story of her fleeing became its own anecdote, and Ilara Blackwood learned, far more brutally than I ever could have taught her, exactly what it costs to value people by their position in a world where position can reverse overnight. I felt no need to add anything to it. The world was doing my work for me, the way the world always does to people like Ilara, eventually, without any help. I had told her in my study that she'd end up alone with whoever had the most money and the least love, and the capital was simply arranging the prophecy on schedule. But here is the thing I want to be clear about, because it's the difference between this story and the small, cruel stories it resembles. I took no campaign against any of them. I did not order the society pages to turn on my family. I did not whisper against Ilara in the salons. I did not have to. The entire reversal happened on its own, driven by the same shallow machinery that had elevated them in the first place, because a society that values only power will always turn on the powerless the instant power moves, and my family and Ilara had spent their lives feeding that machine, and the machine, in its turn, fed on them. I had only to do the one thing I'd done my whole life, which was hold my own line and let the world reveal what it was. They had judged me by appearances, so I let appearances judge them back, and the judgment was far more thorough and far more cruel than anything I would have lowered myself to arrange. I spent those days mostly with the army, and with the Empress, and with Felix, who I made commander of the Third Army on the merit he'd earned, the first man in 300 years to hold that command without inheriting it. And I watched my real family, the forged one, rise alongside me, the Coldfell veterans into positions of honor, the frontier divisions into the respect they'd always deserved, the unwanted men of the Northern Range into the heroes the Empire could no longer pretend it hadn't thrown away. Because that was the part of the victory that actually mattered to me, not the fall of the Kanes, which was inevitable and self-inflicted, but the rise of the men who'd held the line, the redemption of everyone the Empire had discarded the way it had discarded me. I had spent my life as the unwanted son. Now I was the Marshal, and I used every ounce of the power my family had handed me by throwing it away to make sure that the Empire would never again so casually discard the people it found inconvenient. Because I knew, better than anyone alive, what the Empire threw away when it threw away its unwanted sons. It threw away its sword. And the capital, watching the unwanted men of the frontier rise into honor while the great house of Vance fell into ruin, finally understood the lesson I'd spent 15 years embodying and they'd spent 15 years failing to learn. That worth is not inherited, and status is not the same as value, and the person you throw away in the dark might be the one who comes back holding everything, and that the only safe way to treat a human being, the only way that doesn't eventually destroy you, is to treat them as if their true worth might be invisible to you, because it so often is. My family had thrown away the sword of the Empire because they could only see the plain coat, and the whole capital had agreed with them for 15 years. And now the whole capital was pretending it never had, and elevating me as shamelessly as it had once dismissed me, and I trusted its new worship exactly as little as I'd been wounded by its old contempt, which is to say, not at all. Because I'd seen the machine from the inside, and I knew that the only judgments worth anything came from people who'd bled beside you when you had nothing, and that those people had never once doubted me, and never would. The capital made me, then it unmade me, then it remade me. And through all of it, I was exactly the same man I'd been on the Coldfell Ridge, because the Ridge had made me proof against the capital's machine forever, and that, in the end, was the real inheritance. The one no family could give and no society could take. The unbreakable knowledge of my own worth, earned in the snow, witnessed by the Empire, and immune to the opinion of every drawing room in Aurelia. Duke Calder did not go quietly because traitors never do, and a cornered traitor with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous animal in any court. Felix brought me the warning 2 days after my family crawled out of my study, and it was the warning I'd been bracing for since I understood the shape of Calder's treason. "He knows the investigation's closing on him, sir," Felix said. "He's too smart not to. Half his Volthon communications run through the protocol office, and he knows we have access now. So he's not going to wait to be arrested. A man like Calder has one move left, and it's the move all of them make at the end." Felix's face was grim. "He's going to try to take the throne down with him. Not the crown, he can't reach the crown anymore. The person, the Empress. If Anya Sterling dies before the investigation goes public, the succession crisis swallows everything. The treason case dissolves into chaos, and the consort faction, with Calder's hand-picked candidates, moves to fill the vacuum. Killing her is the only play that turns his defeat into victory. And the victory celebrations give him the perfect window. Every noble house in the Empire gathered in one place, security stretched across 1,000 guests, the Empress exposed in public for the first time since the war. He set down the slate. "The Imperial Victory Gala, 3 nights from now. That's where he'll move, sir. It has to be." I felt the Coldfell calm drop over me. The calm that comes when a vague threat becomes a specific battlefield. Because a threat with a time and a place isn't a threat anymore. It's a trap. And traps can be turned. And turning the enemy's trap back on him is the only tactic I've ever truly mastered. "Then we don't prevent it," I said. "We let it happen. Controlled. On our terms." Felix's eyebrows rose, and I explained. "If we arrest Calder now on the evidence we have, he's a duke with a century of court allies and a faction that controls 1/3 of the nobility. He'll claim it's a political purge by the military, the sword seizing power. Exactly the story the consort faction has been building for 2 years. He'll fight it in the courts and the salons for a year, and even if he loses, he'll have poisoned the Empire's trust in the Empress and in me. Evidence of communications isn't enough to bury a duke. We need him caught in the act. We need the entire court, every noble house, every camera, to watch Duke Calder try to murder the Empress with their own eyes. Then there's no political purge, no military coup story, no defense. There's just a traitor caught reaching for the sovereign's throat in front of the whole empire. I looked at Felix. So we let him think the gala is his window. We let his plan proceed. And we make sure that when he reaches for her, the only thing he finds is us. It was a terrible thing to propose, and I knew it. And I went to the Empress myself that night and laid it out, because I would not use Anya Sterling as bait without her consent. Not for the Empire, not for anything. I found her in her private study, and I told her everything. The threat, the gala, the plan to let Calder commit himself in public so his treason could be proven beyond any political defense, and the part she'd have to play, which was to stand exposed in front of her whole court, knowing a traitor was coming to kill her, and trust me to stop it. She listened without interrupting, the Winter Queen, gray eyes steady, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You're asking me to stand in the open and let a man try to murder me, on the theory that you'll stop him before he succeeds." A pause. Most of my advisors would tell me to arrest Calder tonight and accept the political cost. It's the safe choice, the careful choice. It is, I agreed. And it's the wrong one, because the political cost isn't paid by you. It's paid by the Empire, in trust, for a generation. Calder has spent 2 years building the story that you're a young woman controlled by her military, that the sword has captured the crown. If we purge him quietly, we prove his story true. The only way to end him without proving him right is to let the whole Empire watch him reach for your throat. I held her eyes. But it's your throat, Anya, so it's your choice. I'll arrest him tonight if you tell me to, and we'll pay the political cost together, and I'll never once say you were wrong to choose your own life over a cleaner victory. I'm not asking you to be brave for the Empire. I'm telling you the truth about the trade, the way I promised you on a frozen ridge I always would, and then I'm going to do whatever you decide. And the Empress of Aurelia looked at her marshal, and slowly the Winter Queen's rare smile came to her face, the dangerous one. The one that meant she'd decided to destroy someone. 3 years ago, I flew into a war zone because I refused to let cowards make my decisions out of fear, she said. I'm not going to start cowering now because the war moved indoors. She rose and crossed to me, and she did something she had never done in 3 years. She reached up and put her hand flat against the single star at my collar, the star she'd pinned there on the ridge, and she said quietly, "I'll stand in the open. I'll let him come. Because I trust exactly one person in this empire to stand between me and a knife, and it's the man my own court tried to marry to my would-be murderer's scheme without ever realizing he was already the only person I'd ever choose." Her gray eyes held mine. "Don't let him reach me, Ethan. And after, when it's done, when there's no faction left to use the truth against us." She didn't finish it. She didn't have to. We'd been not finishing that sentence for 3 years, and we both knew that after the gala, there would be nothing left in the way. The Imperial Victory Gala was the largest gathering of the Aurelian nobility in a generation, the great hall of the palace blazing with light, every noble house in attendance, the Empress presiding over the celebration of the war her marshal had won. My family was there, diminished and shunned, the Vance name already a cautionary tale, my father gray and silent, Serafina clinging to a dignity no one would grant her, Landon sullen in a corner. And Duke Calder was there, of course, master of the protocol office, smiling and gracious and circulating among his faction, a knife wrapped in silk, waiting for his window. I had spent 3 days preparing the battlefield. The gala's security was, on the surface, exactly what Calder expected, stretched thin across 1,000 guests, the Empress exposed and accessible. Underneath, it was the most controlled killing ground I had ever designed. Every member of Calder's faction was watched. Every entrance and exit was mine. The wine stewards near the Empress were Coldfell veterans, and I stood at the Empress's side through the evening in my dress uniform, the marshal in his proper place beside his sovereign, watching Duke Calder watch us, 2 predators in a blazing hall, each waiting for the other to move. He moved at the toast. It was elegant, I'll give him that, the plan of a man who'd spent his life in the machinery of the court. At the height of the evening, the Empress rose to give the victory toast, the moment when every eye in the hall was on her, and the security flowed naturally toward the dais. And Calder had arranged for one of his agents, disguised as a wine steward, to approach the dais in the crush with a blade hidden in a serving cloth, to strike in the chaos of the toast when 1,000 bodies pressed close and a single knife could vanish into the crowd. It was a good plan. It would have worked against any security the court could have mustered. It did not work against a marshal who'd been raised to see knives before they were drawn. I'd identified Calder's agent 2 hours earlier, the moment he took his position, because a man carrying a weapon moves differently than a man carrying wine, and I'd spent 15 years learning to read that difference in the half-second it buys you on a frozen ridge. So when the Empress rose to toast and the false steward began his drift toward the dais through the crush, I was already moving, and the Coldfell veterans were already closing, and the trap I'd built around Anya Sterling snapped shut with the precision of an army that had broken the greatest offensive in 3 centuries. The agent got within 10 feet of the Empress. He drew the blade, and in front of the entire assembled nobility of the Aurelian Empire, every camera, every house, every eye, the Grand Marshal of Aurelia stepped between the knife and the sovereign, took the man's wrist, broke it, and put him on the floor, and the Coldfell veterans had the hall sealed before the gasp finished crossing the room. And I stood over the would-be assassin, the Empress safe behind me, and I raised my eyes to find Duke Calder across the hall, his face a mask of dawning horror, understanding that his last move had failed in the most public way possible, in front of the whole empire, with his agent alive and in custody and about to name him. "Duke Calder," I said, and my voice carried across the silent hall, the voice that moved armies. "By the authority of the throne and the office of the Grand Marshal, you are under arrest for high treason against the Aurelian Empire, for selling this empire's military secrets to the Valthon Confederacy, for engineering the offensive that killed thousands of our soldiers, and, as every person in this hall has just witnessed with their own eyes, for the attempted assassination of the Empress." I let the words fall into the absolute silence. "Your faction is finished. Your agent is in custody and will testify. And your treason is no longer a matter of evidence to be argued in salons. It is a thing this entire court just watched you attempt." The Coldfell veterans closed on the Duke from every side. "You spent 2 years telling the Empire that the sword had captured the crown, that the Empress was a young woman controlled by her military. So let the Empire see the truth instead. The truth they just watched. The military didn't capture the crown. The military just saved it. From you." Duke Calder was taken in front of the whole assembled nobility, and there was no political defense left to him, no story of a purge, no claim of a coup, because 1,000 witnesses and every camera in the empire had watched his knife reach for the Empress and watched the Marshal stop it. The consort faction collapsed overnight, its leader a proven traitor and assassin, its members scrambling to disavow him. And the story the faction had spent 2 years building, the dangerous story that the sword had captured the crown, died completely, replaced forever by the image the whole empire had just seen. The Marshal stepping between the knife and the Empress, the sword defending the throne with his body. It was, I understood even in the moment, the thing that finally made it possible. The thing that cleared the last obstacle from the sentence Anya and I had been not finishing for 3 years. Because after that night, no one in the empire could ever again claim that a marriage between the Empress and her Marshal was the military seizing power. The whole empire had watched the truth. The sword had thrown itself between its sovereign and death, in public, asking nothing. After that, a union between the throne and the sword wasn't a faction's coup. It was the love story the entire empire had just witnessed with its own eyes, and wanted, the way people always want the true thing once they've finally seen it. And my family, standing diminished and shunned at the edge of that hall, watched the disowned son they'd thrown into the dark step between a traitor's knife and the Empress of Aurelia, and watched the whole empire understand, in a single moment, that he had not only become the most powerful soldier in the realm, but was about to become something even my stepmother's wildest ambition had never dared imagine for her golden boy. Serafina had petitioned to marry Landon to the Empress as the family's reach for ultimate glory, and she stood in that hall and watched the son she'd disowned become, by the Empire's own acclamation, the only man the Winter Queen would ever marry, and she understood at last the full and perfect dimensions of what her greed had thrown away. I knelt by the captured assassin as the guards took Calder, and I checked the blade he'd carried, and I went cold, because I recognized something on it, a maker's mark. And I understood that the night had one more revelation in it, one I hadn't seen coming, because the blade was Aurelian, court issue, from the protocol office's own ceremonial stores, which meant Calder's agent had been supplied from inside the palace, by someone with protocol office access, someone who'd helped arm the assassination, someone whose small, bitter cooperation had nearly killed the Empress. And I knew, with a sick certainty, exactly whose resentment Calder would have found easiest to exploit. A young man, recently humiliated, stripped of his stolen stars, his ambition shattered, his fiancée having tried to leave him, nursing a bottomless grievance against the brother who'd taken everything and the empire that had exposed him. A young man with a foot in the consort faction through his mother's petition, easy to flatter, easy to use, too stupid and too bitter to understand what he was being made part of. Landon. I rose with the blade in my hand, and I looked across the ruined gala to where my brother stood, and I saw it in his face, the guilt, the dawning terror, the understanding that I had found the mark on the blade, and I knew that the story of my family was not finished after all, that there was one more reckoning, the hardest one, and that I was about to have to decide whether my own brother would be tried for his part in the attempted murder of the woman I was going to marry. I had Landon brought to me that same night, not to my residence, but to a secure room in Central Command, because what was about to happen between us was not family business anymore. It was treason business, and the difference would decide whether my brother lived. He was already broken when they brought him in, the sullen defiance gone, replaced by the shaking terror of a man who's finally understood the size of the thing he touched. He'd been clever enough to help a traitor, and stupid enough not to ask what he was helping with, which is the exact combination that fills the Empire's prisons. And he stood in front of me now without a trace of the golden boy left, just a frightened young man who'd reached for a way to hurt me and accidentally grabbed the attempted murder of the Empress. "Tell me everything," I said, "and understand that this is the most important conversation of your life, because at the end of it, I'm going to decide whether you're tried as a co-conspirator in the attempted assassination of the sovereign, which carries death, or as a dupe who was used, which carries something survivable. The truth is your only chance. Lie to me once, about anything, and I'll assume the worst and let the courts have you. So, tell me." And he told me, the whole miserable thing, and it was exactly as pathetic as I'd feared. After the finding destroyed his promotion, after the war exposed me, after his humiliation became total, Landon had been approached by one of Calder's people who'd flattered his grievance, who'd told him the Marshal and the Empress were corrupt, that the military had seized the court, that a true patriot of an old military family should help restore the proper balance. They'd asked him for small things at first, court gossip, the movements of certain officials, and then, using his mother's protocol office connections from the petition, access to minor administrative areas, including, on one occasion, the ceremonial stores. He swore he hadn't known what it was for. He swore he thought he was helping a political faction embarrass me, not arm an assassin. And the terrible thing, the thing I believed, was that he was probably telling the truth, that Landon had been exactly stupid and bitter enough to help murder the Empress without ever once asking what the help was for, because asking would have required a moral seriousness he'd never been forced to develop, raised soft and golden and certain that consequences were for other people. "You provided the access that armed the blade that reached for the Empress's throat," I said when he was done. "Whether you knew the final purpose or not, that's what you did. A woman nearly died tonight, the sovereign of this empire, because your bitterness made you easy to use. Do you understand that? Not the politics, the fact. Anya Sterling nearly bled out on a ballroom floor, and part of the reason is you." Landon was weeping now, the golden boy entirely gone. "I didn't know, Ethan. I swear to God I didn't know. I hated you. You took everything. You made me nothing in front of the whole empire, and they said I could hurt you back. And I was so angry I didn't ask. I didn't want to know. I just wanted to not be nothing." He sank to his knees. "Please, please. I know I don't deserve it. I know what I am, but please don't let them kill me. I'll do anything. I'll confess everything. I'll testify against Calder. I'll spend my life making it right. Just please." And here is where the story of my family finally became a story about me, and about the choice that separates a man from the people who made him. Because I could have ended Landon. Easily. Justly, even, by one reading. He had helped arm an assassin who'd tried to kill the woman I loved. The courts would have taken him on my word, and every cruelty my family had ever done me, the exile to Coldfell, the stolen inheritance, the jilted fiancé, the stolen stars, the high, ugly laugh in the dark, enjoy the ditch, all of it pointed at the same satisfying end, the golden boy on his knees, begging the brother he'd wronged for a life he didn't deserve, and the brother saying no. But I had spent 15 years becoming something other than the people who threw me away. And the whole point of that becoming, the thing that made it worth more than my father's fortune and Seraphina's ambition and Landon's stolen stars, was that I was not them. They were people who, given power over someone weaker, used it to discard them. And the deepest revenge available to me, the only one that actually meant anything, was not to destroy Landon. It was to be, in the moment I held his life in my hand, the thing none of them had ever been to me. Just. Not cruel, not merciful, just. Get up, I said. Kneeling doesn't move me. It never moved them when I did it, and I won't pretend it moves me now. He got up, shaking. Here's what's going to happen, and it's not for you. None of this is for you. It's for the Empress, and for the truth, and for the man I've decided to be, which is not the man who raised you. I sat back. You'll be tried. Not for assassination, you didn't know. And I won't lie to a court any more than I'd lie to my Empress, even to damn you. You'll be tried for what you actually did, which is providing material aid to a treasonous faction through criminal negligence. It carries prison. Years of it. Hard years. In a real prison, not a comfortable one. You'll lose what little of the name is left. You'll come out middle-aged with nothing, the way you tried to leave me, except you'll have actually earned it. I held his eyes. And here's the part that's the real sentence, Landon, the part worse than prison. You'll come out knowing that the brother you spent your whole life helping to destroy is the only reason you're alive. That when I held your life in my hand, the way you all held mine, I chose justice instead of cruelty, because I'm better than the family that made us. You'll have to live the rest of your life knowing that I was the better man. Not because I won, because of what I did when I'd already won and could have done anything. That's your sentence. Now get out of my sight and go tell the prosecutors everything and bury Calder with it. And try, in whatever years you have, to become a fraction of the man you could have been if you'd ever once been told no. They took Landon away to testify. And his testimony, the protocol access, the ceremonial stores, the faction's approach, sealed Calder's fate beyond any defense. And the Duke and his treason died in the courts as completely as they died in the ballroom. The Empire was safe. The war was won. The traitor was finished. And the Vance family was, at last, exactly what its greed had earned. A ruined house, its golden son in prison, its name a permanent lesson, its reach finally and forever ended. My father came to me one last time before the sentencing, and I let him in, because I'd told him at my residence that the next time he appeared, it would be because I summoned him. And I'd decided, after the gala, after Landon, to summon him once. He came in old and gray and straight-backed, a soldier reporting, and he didn't beg, which I respected, and he didn't make excuses, which I respected more. I came to tell you I've resigned my commission, he said. Effective today. The Third Army goes to Colonel Gray on your recommendation, I'm told, which is right. He earned it and I never did. Not really. I just inherited the stars I was born expecting. He stood in the center of my study. And I came to take the choice you gave me. You said I could spend my years as the disgraced patriarch nursing my wife's ambition, or I could walk away and try to become, in private, the man I was for 11 hours on the eastern flank. He met my eyes, steady. I'm walking away. I'm leaving Seraphina, leaving the estate, leaving the name. I held a line for you once, Ethan, when you'd already given me up for dead, and you told me to remember I was capable of it. I'm going to spend whatever's left trying to be that man. Not for you. You've made it clear, rightly, that there's no reconciliation, and I won't insult you by asking for one. For me. Because for 11 hours, I was the man I should have been, and I'd rather die as him than as what I've been. He came to attention, and he saluted me, his son, his marshal, a full and proper salute. The salute of a soldier to a commander he's finally understood. Thank you for the choice, sir. It's more than I gave you, I know that. I'll know it every day for the rest of my life. And he turned and walked out, and I never reconciled with my father, not really, not in the way that stories like to pretend. But I heard years later that he'd kept his word, that he lived quietly and alone in a small place near the Eastern Range, and that he volunteered at a veterans' home, and that he never spoke of the Vance name or his wife's ambition again, and that the men at the home knew him only as a quiet old soldier who'd once held a line at the worst moment of a great war. And I found, when I heard it, that I was glad, in a complicated way, that one of them had become better. It didn't undo anything, but the world has enough people who only ever become worse, and I was glad my father wasn't one of them in the end. Serafina became nothing, which was the only thing she'd ever truly feared. The estate's influence gone, her husband gone, her golden son in prison, her petition a national joke. She ended her days in a small house with a small allowance the law required me to provide, and I provided without ever once visiting. A woman who'd reached for the throne of the empire and ended with less than the frontier major she'd sneered at, and who had to live every day knowing that the son she'd poisoned and exiled and disowned had become the most powerful man in Aurelia, and had let her keep her small house out of a justice she'd never once shown him. I think that knowledge was a worse prison than Landon's. I hope it was. I'm honest enough to admit I hope it was. And Alara Blackwood, who had jilted me for a position and then tried to jilt my brother for a better one, found that the empire is a small place when your name becomes a punchline, and that the men who value women the way she'd taught them to value her are not men who stay. And the last I heard of her, she'd married a wealthy old man for his position, exactly as I'd told her she would, and was, by all accounts, exactly as cold and as alone as I'd told her she'd be. I took no satisfaction in it. That's not quite true. I took a little. I'm telling you the whole truth in this story or none of it. And the truth is that when I heard about Alara, I smiled for exactly 1 second. And then I went back to my life, which was the real victory, that she occupied 1 second of it, and I occupied all of hers. I married Anya Sterling in the spring, a year after the war, when the last of the consort faction was gone, and there was no one left in the empire to claim that the union of the throne and the sword was anything but what the whole empire had watched at the gala. The man who'd thrown himself between his sovereign and a traitor's knife, and the woman who'd flown into a war to find him. The wedding was the largest celebration in the history of the Aurelian Empire, and I stood at the altar in the dress uniform with the single star, the disowned son, the ditch major, the penniless beggar struck from the family register, and I married the Empress of Aurelia, and became by her hand Prince Consort and Grand Marshal both, the throne and the sword united in one man who'd been thrown away twice and had walked out of the dark each time carrying more than the people who'd discarded him could ever imagine. My father was at the wedding, in the back, quiet, an old soldier in a plain coat, invited by my own choice, the one mercy I extended past justice, because Anya asked me to, and because some part of me, the part the frost hadn't killed, wanted him to see it. Not to gloat, but because he'd held a line for me once and I'd told him to remember he was capable of more, and I wanted him to witness the more that his thrown-away son had become. He wept, they told me, quietly, in the back, and he left before the celebration, and he sent no gift and made no claim and asked for nothing, and that was the most fatherly thing Duncan Vance ever did for me, to come and witness and weep and ask for nothing and leave. People ask me sometimes whether I regret it, the years in the ditch, the exile, the cruelty, the family that threw me away. Whether I'd undo it if I could, have a normal childhood, a father who loved me, a name that wasn't a wound. And I tell them the truth, which is the only thing I've ever consistently been. No, because the ditch made me, the frost made me, cold fell. The place they sent me to die is the place that forged the sword that saved the empire and won the only things I've ever valued. The trust of an empress, the loyalty of soldiers who'd follow me into hell, the love of a woman who flew into a war to find the truth, and the quiet certainty, every single day, that I am not the people who made me. They threw me into the dark to be forgotten, and the dark didn't forget me, it forged me, and I walked out of it carrying the empire in one hand and my own true self in the other, and there is not a fortune or a name or a comfortable childhood in the world I'd trade for that. They told me to enjoy the ditch. So I did. I enjoyed it so completely that I became the sword of an empire in it, and married its throne, and watched the family that dug it for me fall, one by one, into the holes their own greed had prepared, while I rose past everything they'd ever reached for, on the strength of the one thing they'd tried hardest to throw away and could never, ever take back. The work of my own hands, sealed in black ink, under the authority of the throne. Mine, only ever mine. From the ditch to the throne, and every step of it earned, and not 1 inch of it inheritable, transferable, or able to be signed away to a golden boy, no matter how many lawyers a desperate family hires. I gave up $1 billion fortune and tore up my own bloodline rather than hand my military merits to my little brother. It was the best decision I ever made, because the fortune was theirs to give, and they took it back, and it turned out to be worth nothing. But the merits were mine. The work was mine. The self was mine. And those no one could take, no one could give, and no one, in the end, could stand against. And I built an empire's salvation and a life worth living out of the one thing my family was too small to understand was the only thing that ever mattered. They kept the fortune. I kept myself. And I won.